Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into a world where sin isn't just a mistake, it's your birthright, your body, a battleground, your desires, whispers from the devil himself. And the biggest threat to your soul? It might just be that warm, confusing tingle below your belt. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where the church doesn't just frown on your bedroom habits, it builds an entire system of fear, guilt, and eternal damnation around them. And yeah, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your city and the current time in the comments. I want to see who's listening to this at 3 AM while lying flat and contemplating medieval doom. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're born into a world already convinced you're corrupt. The year is something like 1237, and from the moment your lungs fill with cold air in that stone-cold church or dirt-packed hut, you're already in spiritual debt. Why? Because of something two mythical nudists did in a garden several thousand years ago. That's right, your soul is stained because Adam and Eve had the audacity to munch on a knowledge fruit and then notice each other's body parts. This idea, called original sin, is the foundation of everything you're going to be taught about sex. And trust me, it's going to be a lot. By the time you're old enough to even ask a question about where babies come from, you've already been told you're a little sinner. The church isn't subtle about it either. Baptism is a race against the clock. If a baby dies unbaptized, there's a good chance their soul doesn't go to heaven. The fear starts early. Death is always nearby, and salvation is conditional. You might not understand why being born is such a problem, but you'll understand the fear that trails behind it. At the heart of it is this uneasy belief that the body is filthy and desire is dangerous. Sex isn't just a physical act, it's a spiritual minefield. You've probably already heard some chilling Latin during Mass. Words like concupiscentia, which basically means lust, but sounds like a spell from the demon dictionary. It's whispered with the same tone you'd use for a disease, and in a way it is, according to the church. Lust infects your soul, separates you from God, and opens the door to eternal damnation. So yeah, have fun hitting puberty. Of course, these ideas don't just fall out of the sky. You can thank Saint Augustine, one of the OG theologians of Western Christianity, for setting a lot of this in motion. After a wild youth, which, by the way, included a mistress, a child out of wedlock, and a quote-unquote prayer that went, "Lord, make me chaste, but not yet," Augustine swung hard the other way. His spiritual makeover turned him into one of the most powerful voices of sexual paranoia in church history. For Augustine, sex after the fall was always tied to shame. Even married sex, even baby-making sex, if it felt good, it was tainted. Now, here's where it gets weird. The church starts to treat pleasure like it's accidental. Like, sure, you might have to have sex to make kids, fine, but if you enjoy it, that's suspect. The pleasure isn't the point, it's the side effect, and you should be ashamed of it. This is the message you're steeped in from childhood. Priests hammer it home in sermons, artwork shows you the terrifying consequences, and every sin tally gets filed under your eternal credit report. Spoiler, everyone's is maxed out. Even weirder, there's a fringe belief that even babies might express some kind of sinful pleasure. I know, it sounds absurd, but medieval theologians were dead serious. Some of them speculated that even an infant's wiggle or coo might signal a corrupted nature, that deep internal rot passed down from Eden. Innocence, as we think of it today, wasn't really a thing back then. Childhood wasn't pure, it was precarious. And the church made sure that fear soaked in early. Now don't get it twisted, not everyone was walking around terrified 24/7. People were still people. They flirted, fooled around, had affairs, even Dobby laughed at the hypocrisy. But the church's voice was everywhere. In the laws, in the art, in the very rhythm of your days. There were saints to venerate and sins to confess. Feast days and fast days. And through it all, an invisible pressure that followed you to your deathbed, whispering that your body was your enemy. Of course, none of this was a one-size-fits-all policy. There were heated debates behind cathedral doors. Some theologians tried to argue that sex within marriage wasn't sinful if you approached it with the right mindset. Others doubled down, insisting that even married couples should strive for abstinence whenever possible. Scholars still argue about how widespread or effective these teachings actually were. Was the average medieval villager trembling in guilt after a romp in the hayloft? Or were they just trying to stay warm and make babies? Hard to say. What we do know is that fear was the fuel, fear of hell, fear of shame, fear of excommunication. The church didn't need to patrol every bedroom. It just needed to make you feel like it might. Internalized fear is a pretty solid surveillance system after all. And in a world where illness, war and famine are a constant threat, the last thing you want is to mess things up with God. So you learn to stay quiet. You learn to feel guilt before you feel desire. And when desire does creep in, and it always does, you tuck it away in your mental dungeon and hope no one notices. Because in the end, the real punishment isn't fire and brimstone. It's the voice in your head that says you're already lost. Let's say you make it to adolescence without spontaneously combusting from guilt. Lucky you! But things are about to get much weirder. Because now you're noticing stuff. You know, how the baker's daughter laughs a little too loudly when you pass, or how your skin warms at the brush of someone's sleeve. That's normal, right? Natural even? Not in the Middle Ages. Nope. That's not chemistry, it's spiritual sabotage. And this is where one man's anxiety becomes everyone else's burden. Saint Augustine again, returning for his encore performance. Augustine wasn't just influential. He was the guy when it came to early Christian ideas about desire. He had a whole philosophy built around how dangerous sexual passion was, especially because it seemed to override reason. That was the core of his fear, the body doing something the soul didn't agree to. In his mind, pre-fall humans had total control. Adam could, supposedly, decide when to get aroused, like flipping a switch. But after that bite of forbidden fruit, all bets were off. The body revolted. Desire became disobedient. And that terrified him. So what did the church do with that fear? It institutionalized it. It taught that lust wasn't just a feeling, it was a moral failing, corruption that could lead to eternal damnation. And unlike a passing bad mood or a flash of anger, lust was sticky. It lingered. It invaded dreams. It showed up in the very architecture of the world, whispering from the shadows and tucked inside every curve of the body. You didn't just have lust, you were lustful by design. And that meant constant vigilance. You hear this from the pulpit, of course. Priests quote Augustine almost verbatim. Lust is not love. Desire is disorder. But it's not just Sunday sermons, it's in the artwork too. Medieval churches are filled with visual horror stories. Carvings on cathedral doors show naked figures writhing in hellfire. There's always someone being devoured, whipped, or chased by demonic creatures with very suspiciously shaped tails. These aren't abstract metaphors, they're warnings. Lust leads to torment. And torment isn't just theoretical, it's right there, frozen in stone. And then there are the mystery plays, local performances meant to teach Christian morality. These weren't subtle. In one, a character playing lust struts across the stage, decked out like a medieval sex icon, before being dragged screaming into hell by a demon with a massive tongue. These performances were the medieval version of after-school specials, except with more fire and a bigger budget for fake blood. You watched, you laughed nervously, and you remembered, the path to hell is paved with boners. Even poetry got in on the act. Religious verses would sneak in lines about temptation, maybe a knight too enchanted by a maiden's beauty, or a widow too interested in remarriage. And those lines were never the point. They were cautionary. Love could exist, sure, but only in a narrow, pre-approved format. Anything outside that, any hint of passion or uncontrolled longing, wasn't just risky, it was deadly. Now here's something quirky. Some medieval thinkers genuinely believed that desire was transferred physically, like disease. One theory suggested that a man's lust could pollute a woman through his gaze alone. If he looked at her the wrong way, it could spark impure thoughts in her heart, whether she wanted them or not. Eye contact became a moral event. This is why so many religious women, nuns especially, were encouraged to avert their eyes and hide their faces. Not out of shyness, but defense. The male gaze wasn't just annoying, it was spiritually radioactive. And speaking of women, the fear around lust doubled when applied to them. Augustine might have set the tone, but the church expanded it with gusto. Eve, after all, was the one who tempted Adam. That's how the narrative went. And by extension, all women were considered morally weaker, more susceptible to temptation, and more likely to cause it. You, as a medieval woman, were told that your body was a trap. Your voice, Allure, your hair, dangerous. Let that sink in. Your hair could lead someone to hell. Some nuns even shaved their heads as a symbol of total renunciation. Of course, not everyone nodded along to all this. There were scholars who thought maybe the human body wasn't pure evil. Some even argued that marital love was a sacred thing, and that desire inside of marriage didn't have to be shameful. But those voices were quieter, and they had to be careful. Anything that sounded too soft on sin risked a heresy trial. And let's just say the Inquisition didn't believe in second chances. The debate gets even messier when you add in the issue of memory. What if you remembered a lustful act but didn't do it again? Did the memory itself become a sin? Could you be damned for a thought, a dream, or a lingering mental image from 5 years ago? Many church officials said yes. This turned confession into a spiritual tightrope walk. You'd sit across from a priest, eyes downcast, and try to explain just how guilty you felt for thinking about your neighbour's shoulders during prayer. It's both tragic and a little bit absurd. This is where we see a deeper pattern. Fear wasn't just about keeping people pure, it was about keeping them controlled. If you could convince someone that even their thoughts could send them to hell, they'd self-police like pros. You didn't need an army to enforce morality. You just needed enough fear baked into the culture to keep people afraid of themselves. And here's the wildest part. Many people genuinely believed it worked. They saw the fear as proof of faith. If you weren't terrified of your own body, then you clearly didn't understand God. A good Christian was always a little anxious, always a little guilty, always one heartbeat away from confessing something, anything, just to stay ahead of the flames. So here you are, young, confused, full of hormones, and utterly convinced that your body is a spiritual landmine. You want to be good. You really do. But you also have eyes, you also have feelings, you dream, you daydream. You accidentally brush hands with someone and feel a tiny jolt of wonder. And each time it happens, a little voice whispers that this is exactly how souls are lost. Not in war, not in crime, but in blushing, in glancing, in wanting. That's the real battlefield. And spoiler, the church isn't about to ease up. So now you're carrying this invisible weight everywhere you go. Lust is sin, desire is danger, your body is a liability, and your thoughts might be worse. But you know what's really infuriating? All of this goes back to two people, a snake and a fruit tree. The whole medieval nightmare around sex is hanging off a single story, and that story is the fall of man. You might have heard it as a kid. Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, frolicking around in perfect innocence, until Eve picks the wrong snack. But in the Middle Ages, this wasn't just a myth. It was a moral crime scene. And you, thousands of years later, are still serving the sentence. The church built its entire doctrine of sexual shame on this foundation. The moment Eve bit the fruit, innocence shattered. Not just for her, not just for Adam, for everyone. This act introduced sin into the world, and not just any sin. It was the original sin, the one that left a crack in human nature so deep that even newborn babies weren't safe. And the most visible sign of that damage? You guessed it. Sexual desire. That's why, according to medieval theology, the first thing Adam and Eve did after the fall was realize they were naked and get ashamed. That sudden awareness of the body, of its pull and power, was proof that desire had tainted them, and you. And let's not skip over the subtext here. It was Eve who sinned first. Sure, Adam followed her lead, but the church made it crystal clear who bore the blame. Women were seen as spiritually weaker, morally fragile, and physically more tempting. So while everyone was burdened with original sin, women were its original delivery system. That little theological footnote turned into centuries of paranoia about female sexuality. If men were vulnerable to lust, then women were the weapon that delivered it. It doesn't help that medieval writers loved leaning into this trope. From biblical commentaries to popular stories, women were portrayed as temptresses, sirens, distractions from holiness. In one text, a monk declares that women are the snare of Satan. In another, a bishop writes that even looking at a woman could lead a man to mortal sin. That's how deep the fear ran. A glance, a scent, a laugh. It was never just flirting, it was a full-scale spiritual ambush. And what about marriage, you ask? Surely there had to be some safe zone where people could express love and desire without damning themselves. Well, kind of. The church officially allowed sex within marriage, but even then it was a narrow hallway of rules and warnings. Sex was only for procreation. Pleasure was never the goal. If you happened to enjoy it, fine, but you'd better feel bad about it afterward. Married couples were even encouraged to abstain during certain times. Lent, Advent, Sundays, Wednesdays, Fridays, before receiving communion after childbirth during menstruation. Depending on how closely you followed the rules, there weren't many days left on the calendar. And yet, despite all the pressure, people still got married. They still fell in love. They still had sex, a lot of it judging by the size of medieval families. But here's the key difference. Every act came bundled with anxiety. Even inside the most sacred church-approved version of sex, you weren't really safe. You still had to wrestle with guilt. You still had to confess. And you still had to convince yourself and your priest that you weren't enjoying it too much. Now, here's a fascinating debate. Some scholars argue that the idea of original sin didn't actually make people feel more shame. It gave them a way to explain why they were struggling in the first place. It wasn't your fault you had impure thoughts, it was baked into your DNA. In this light, original sin became a weird form of comfort. Like, of course I messed up, I'm human. But even if that's true, the comfort doesn't last long, because being human still meant being at constant risk. The church didn't want you feeling too okay about your imperfections. A little guilt was healthy, a lot of guilt was better. And oh, did the church deliver on that. You couldn't escape the imagery. Walk into any cathedral and it's all fire, snakes and suffering, Adam and Eve being cast out naked and sobbing, angels with swords, devils with claws, and above it all, Christ on the cross, silent, bleeding, reminding you that this was the cost of sin. That image wasn't just decoration. It was theology carved in stone. Your desire had consequences. Even your language changed under the weight of it. The vocabulary of love was laced with terms like temptation, defilement, and chastity. Words that once meant beauty or passion were warped into something dangerous. The church's vocabulary didn't really have room for nuance. Love was either holy or it was not. And guess what? If it involved your body, it probably wasn't. Here's a fun fringe fact. Some medieval theologians tried to figure out what sex was like before the fall. They imagined Adam and Eve getting it on without lust, like some kind of spiritually sanitized version of intimacy. No awkward fumbling, no passion, just polite, divinely approved procreation, emotionless and fully rational. Can you even imagine? That was the ideal. That's what the church wanted you to strive for. Sex that felt like an academic transaction. Meanwhile, back in your medieval village, none of this lofty theology changes the fact that you're still, alive. You still have feelings. You still get distracted. You still stare too long. And now, thanks to the church's obsessive focus on Eden, you feel a jolt of guilt every time your heart beats a little faster. Because no matter how hard you try, you can't shake the feeling that you're somehow reenacting the fall every time you feel a spark. And so it builds. The shame, the silence, the fear, generation after generation, passed from parent to child, reinforced in confession, echoed in sermons, painted on the walls, and no one really questions it. Not yet. Because this isn't just about religion anymore. It's about identity. Being human means being fallen. Your desire proves your corruption. And until the world ends or Christ returns, you're stuck with that knowledge, like a low, constant ache behind your ribs. You weren't there when Eve bit the fruit, but you're the one paying for it. Every day, every dream, every moment you look at someone and feel something stir, that's your inheritance, not gold, not wisdom, shame. Let's say you survive into adulthood, already a miracle in the Middle Ages, and somehow manage to avoid getting branded a heretic, caught in a war, or dying of the plague. You've heard about sin your whole life. You've sat through sermons that made you squirm, whispered shamefully in confessionals, and spent more nights than you'd like to admit wrestling with dreams that left you feeling like a prill swamp. And now, maybe, you're married. Or trying to be, and you're wondering, is this finally the part where things get better? Spoiler alert, it's not. Because marriage, for the medieval church, wasn't a celebration of love and passion. It was damage control. Let's be clear, sex itself wasn't forbidden. It wasn't even optional. The church needed people to reproduce, to fill the pews, grow the economy, and raise new Christians. But that didn't mean it liked sex. In fact, the church treated it like a necessary evil, a begrudging nod to human weakness. Marriage was the institution that kept desire locked in a tiny rule-bound box. And if you coloured outside those lines, eternal consequences. Imagine you're newly married. Maybe you actually like your spouse, which is a bonus, because in many cases, marriages are arranged, less about love and more about dowries, land and alliances. You stand before a priest, promise to remain faithful, and maybe even sneak a smile at your partner. It's a hopeful moment. But behind all that ceremony, there's an unspoken warning. Don't enjoy this too much. The medieval church officially listed 3 goods of marriage: procreation, fidelity, and a sort of regulated, controlled outlet for lust. You could have sex, you could even like the person you were doing it with, but pleasure for its own sake? That was a slippery slope. Even within the sanctity of marriage, sex was only not sinful if it was done with the right mindset, meaning it had to be for babies, not fun. So how did people actually deal with that? Well, awkwardly. There were manuals written for confessors, priests who heard your sins, and there they included shockingly detailed guidelines. These guides catalogued every possible sexual act, intention and context, all in an effort to determine just how bad your sin was. Did you have sex during Lent? Sin. Did you do it just because you wanted to, even though you are married? Still a sin. Did you do anything extra? Bigger sin. The church had turned the bedroom into a courtroom, and the list of offences was long. There's even this notion of a marital debt. It sounds like a medieval credit problem, but it's actually about obligation. If your spouse wanted sex, you were required to provide it, unless you were both fasting, menstruating, pregnant, recovering from childbirth, or in mourning. But here's the twist. If you had sex just to fulfill that obligation without pure intentions, you might still rack up a sin point. Basically, you're stuck in a spiritual loophole that makes it very hard to win. Meanwhile, the ultimate sexual ideal was celibacy, not in marriage, instead of marriage. The holiest path was total abstinence. That's why priests, monks, and nuns were held in such high esteem. They renounced sex altogether. They gave up marriage, family, and every natural urge in pursuit of divine purity. And in doing so, they set an impossible standard for everyone else. Even married folks were encouraged to imitate the celibate life when they could. It was like being praised for having a job while being constantly reminded that quitting your job entirely would be holier. This created a cultural obsession with virginity, especially female virginity. A woman's chastity wasn't just a personal virtue, it was social currency. Virgins were prized, not just because of purity, but because they hadn't yet fallen. They were seen as closer to Eve before the apple. Brides were examined. Stories circulated about miraculous signs, glowing auras, supernatural visions that confirmed a woman's untouched status. And once that status was gone, well, good luck. You could be forgiven, sure, but you'd never be revered. Here's where things get stranger. Some theologians argued that married couples could achieve a higher spiritual state by abstaining from sex even after marriage. Total voluntary abstinence, what they called spiritual marriage, was seen as the gold standard. A few couples reportedly agreed to this, living under one roof but sleeping in separate beds. Choosing salvation over intimacy, was this common? Not really. Was it held up as the ideal? Absolutely. The message was clear. True holiness meant rejecting the body, even if you had legal permission to use it. And of course, there's no shortage of contradictions. Take the story of Saint Cecilia, a popular figure in medieval legend. On her wedding night, she told her husband that an angel would strike him dead if he touched her. That was supposed to be a sign of her purity, and of his eventual spiritual awakening. Romantic, right? It's basically, I love you, but if you get naked, you'll die. And this was held up as an inspirational tale. Scholars still debate how widespread these attitudes were among the common folk. Sure, theologians and bishops wrote endlessly about lust and purity, but did the average peasant couple living in a one-room hut with 7 kids really spend time agonizing over whether last Tuesday's sex was for procreation or pleasure? Maybe not, but the framework was always there. The church created a moral atmosphere where desire was never safe. Even if you weren't consciously following every rule, the shadow of those teachings hung over you like smoke, and the fear didn't stop at the bedroom door. It followed you into church, into concern, into your own thoughts. Because if you were caught or even suspected of deviating from the approved script, there were consequences. Public penance, fines, shaming, excommunication, and worst of all, the fear that God was watching, always watching. That's the beauty of the internalized fear. It turns you into your own prison guard. It's worth noting that not everyone accepted this system quietly. There were pockets of resistance, poets, lovers, even a few rebellious priests, who tried to carve out a more human version of love. But those voices were often drowned out by the fire and brimstone. And even when people did rebel, they rarely escaped the guilt entirely. The fear had been too well planted, too carefully watered. So here you are, married, legit, and still terrified that your desire is a ticking spiritual bomb. You do what's expected, say the right prayers, follow the calendar, confess often, and try not to enjoy anything too much. Because in the medieval imagination, pleasure is always 1 inch away from punishment. And love is holy, sure, but only if it walks the narrowest of lines and never looks back. Let's talk about your dreams. No, not the noble, wholesome kind where you imagine building a better life or mastering the lute. We're talking about the other kind, the steamy, shadowy, late-night variety that creeps into your sleep like an uninvited guest. In the Middle Ages, you can't even get away from the church while unconscious. Because if you wake up a little flushed, a little breathless, a little damp, congrats. You've probably just consorted with demons. Yep, that's a real thing. Welcome to the wonderfully bizarre theology of demonic desire. So imagine this. You're a pious man trying very hard to walk the narrow path. You fast, you pray, you confess. You avoid eye contact with the milkmaid. You're doing all the right things, but one night your brain betrays you. You dream of temptation. You wake up in a sweat, confused, and, let's be honest, pretty sure your sheets need to be washed. According to medieval belief, that wasn't just a dream. That was an attack. And not from your own imagination, no. That was the work of incubi, male demons that creep into your bedroom and get freaky while you sleep. Incubi weren't just invented to spice up folklore, they were serious business. Church leaders genuinely believed in them, especially when trying to explain involuntary sexual experiences. If you experienced something arousing in your sleep, it was far more convenient and way more theological to blame a lusty demon than admit you might be a little repressed. The logic was twisted but clever. Your soul is trying to be pure, so if your body stumbles, something external must be interfering. But don't think the ladies were safe either. For them, there were succubi, the female counterparts. These seductive demons would supposedly seduce sleeping men, collect their, essence, and use it to impregnate women in other beds. Is demon matchmaking at its creepiest. This whole cycle, which honestly sounds like a bad supernatural fanfic, was part of a larger narrative. The body is weak, desire is dangerous, and when all else fails, blame hell. And believe it or not, the church wasn't just talking about this stuff in secret monk meetings. These ideas were in sermons, confessionals, even court records. If a woman claimed to be assaulted in her sleep and woke up with signs of it, that could be written off as a demonic encounter. If a man felt racked with guilt over his nocturnal emissions, those were also demon-caused. In some regions, there were even exorcism rituals specifically for people who believed they'd been targeted by sexual demons. You weren't just confessing sin, you were seeking spiritual cleansing from literal bedtime monsters. Now here's where things get especially tangled. These demonic excuses often served a social function. They gave people, especially celibate clergy, a way to explain away failure. Imagine being a monk who spent years locked in a stone cell, trying to purge yourself of all earthly desires, and then one morning, BAM! You wake up with a situation. You can't blame lust. You definitely can't blame Brother Thomas in the next cell. But a succubus, that's a get-out-of-hell-free card. Of course, this also raises a deliciously uncomfortable debate among scholars. Did people really believe in these night demons? Or were they a psychological tool, a way to cope with guilt and repression in a culture that refused to give people permission to feel normal human things? The answer is probably both. The medieval world was soaked in supernatural belief, but it was also deeply practical. People were smart enough to find creative theological loopholes when needed. And if that meant pointing fingers at invisible demons instead of unpacking your own unresolved desires, so be it. One strange little fringe theory even suggested that demons could become so obsessed with a particular person that they'd follow them around for years, always waiting for moments of vulnerability. This could explain persistent dreams, chronic guilt, or even infertility. There's a recorded case of a nun who believed a demon was married to her and would not leave her alone. She reportedly fasted to the point of illness and still felt the creature's presence every night. Instead of therapy, she got more prayer. You can guess how that went. And for women, things were even more fraught. If a woman dreamed about being seduced, it didn't matter whether it was real. The very idea that she could imagine it, even unconsciously, was seen as proof of her inherent susceptibility to sin. The body, especially the female body, was treated like an unlocked door, always at risk of spiritual home invasion. If you were devout and still experienced desire, then clearly you were under attack. If you weren't devout, well then you were inviting the demons in. But here's the kicker. Demonic desire didn't just target sinners. Sometimes the holier you were, the more you attracted unwanted attention. Saints and mystics often wrote about being tormented by sexual visions, especially during prayer. These weren't private confessions, they were sometimes included in their official biographies. St. Anthony the Great, for example, was supposedly plagued by visions of naked women conjured by the devil while he was out in the desert. His holiness, the story goes, made him a prime target for temptation. This idea created a paradox. Sexual torment wasn't just a sign of weakness, it could also be a badge of honour. If you were being attacked by the lustful demons, it meant you were worth attacking. You were fighting a spiritual battle, and every dream, every struggle, every secret shame was proof that you were locked in combat with hell itself. That sounds noble in theory, until you realise that it also meant your suffering was supposed to be a good thing. Meanwhile, the average medieval person couldn't escape these ideas, even if they wanted to. The church shaped how you viewed yourself, your body, and even your dreams, and if you happened to be someone with a vivid imagination or a healthy libido, well, too bad. Everything you felt was filtered through this bizarre, fear-based lens. No moment of arousal could exist without suspicion. No dream could be innocent. Kbit. Every night your bed became a potential battleground, and you didn't even know who you were fighting until it was over. So what do? You pray harder. You confess more often. You fast, flog yourself, light candles, burn herbs, maybe sleep in your clothes just to avoid temptation. You try not to think, and you certainly don't talk about it, because everyone else is doing the exact same thing. Pretending they're fine, quietly panicking and wondering whether that thing they dreamed last night means they're being hunted by a demon, or just human. And in the end, it barely matters, because in the medieval church's eyes, the difference between your body and a battlefield is paper thin. Let's say you've done everything right. You've avoided lustful glances, kept your thoughts clean, well mostly, and even blamed that one dream on a passing demon. You've confessed your sins, kissed the relics, maybe even lit a candle or two for extra insurance. You're still nervous, but hey, maybe you're on God's good side. And then one day you wander into a church, glance at a fresco near the altar, and suddenly wish you'd never opened your eyes. Because there, in full medieval horror movie detail, are the consequences of messing up, a writhing orgy of pain, fire, and body parts in places they definitely don't belong. Welcome to medieval sin art, where pleasure is punished and hell gets weirdly specific. See, the church wasn't just content to tell you what would happen if you sinned, they wanted to show you. And nothing says fear God like a 20-foot mural of people being flayed, roasted, and dismembered for eternity. But the truly special brand of medieval religious art? It reserved a particularly creative vengeance for sexual sinners. Lust wasn't just bad, it was visually appalling. An artist spared no brushstroke in reminding you. In these paintings and carvings, the lustful are often shown in the company of demons who specialise in humiliating and mutilating the human body. Women with serpents biting their breasts, men with their genitals being devoured by giant rats. A popular motif shows souls impaled, yes, there too, while flames erupt around them in decorative little swirls. It's grotesque, detailed, and always very, very personal. No sin went unpunished. And if you'd ever wondered what damnation looked like, these scenes made sure you knew. It wasn't just eternal, it was specific to your favourite mistake. The most infamous source of this imagery came from a 12th century monk named Peter Damian. His writings were fire and brimstone served on a silver platter. He was especially vicious toward priests who couldn't keep their vows of celibacy, calling them worse than animals and insisting they'd suffer unique torments in hell. The popular imagination picked this up fast. Soon artists began incorporating these hyper-detailed torments into stained glass, manuscript margins, and church facades. And let's be honest, medieval people were into it. This stuff didn't scare everyone into piety, but it sure made an impression. One famous example is the Last Judgment, often painted on cathedral walls or above the church entrance, so you'd see it walking in and out. Christ sits at the centre, serene and glowing, while sinners tumble into chaotic hellscapes on the right. And guess which group gets the worst treatment? You got it, those guilty of lust. Their punishments are always the most graphic, the most painful, and the most humiliating. It sends a clear message. Desire might feel good for 5 minutes, but you'll be paying for it forever, and not in a vague, abstract way. We're talking pitchforks, toads in unspeakable places, and flames licking parts of your anatomy you hoped God wasn't watching. Some of the weirdest details came from a fringe collection of writings called The Vision of Tundale, a kind of medieval near-death experience fanfic. In it, a knight is guided through hell by an angel. He sees a pit where men and women who had sex outside marriage are eaten by worms. In another section, naked souls ride flaming horses that buck them off into boiling rivers. Tundale is horrified. The angel shrugs. They chose pleasure over virtue, he says. This is what they get. The book became wildly popular and was copied all over Europe. Sunday school, medieval style. Now you might think all this is excessive, maybe even theatrical, but that's kind of the point. Medieval religion didn't do subtlety. They knew fear worked. If you couldn't read Latin, couldn't interpret scripture, couldn't debate theology, you could still understand that the guy with the snake in his butt probably did something wrong. It's fear through visuals, fear through fire, fear through pain you could practically feel just by looking at the walls. And of course, this art didn't exist in a vacuum. It was often paired with sermons designed to fan the flames of your anxiety. Preachers would point to the artwork and explain in chilling detail what each punishment meant. This woman opened her body before marriage, or one might say, so now her body is opened forever. Graphic, yes, but also unforgettable. This created a kind of spiritual echo chamber. You weren't just hearing that lust was dangerous, you were seeing it, over and over. And not just in churches. These images bled into popular culture, fables, mystery plays, and even tavern jokes. The message was always the same: sex is a trap and hell is waiting with open jaws. Here's where things get more complicated. Some modern scholars argue that these terrifying scenes weren't just meant to scare, they were also a form of therapy, a kind of grotesque catharsis. You saw the sins, you saw the consequences, and by being shocked and horrified, you could process your guilt and then, hopefully, repent. In this view, the artwork wasn't just moral propaganda, it was spiritual medicine, bitter as it tasted. But others push back. They say these images went too far, that they created a culture where people lived in constant grinding fear of themselves, where even thinking the wrong thing could set you on fire for eternity. And if fear works too well, it stops being productive. It becomes paralyzing. And when your religion paralyzes you, you stop growing, stop reaching, stop living. Still, in the medieval mindset, these visuals served a purpose. They kept communities in line. They reminded you that there were eyes on you, even when you were alone. That your body wasn't just yours. It was a spiritual liability. And one false move could land you in a worm-infested ditch, according to Brother Tundale and every church artist with a good supply of red paint. So what do you do after seeing something like that? You probably walk a little slower, pray a little harder, maybe clutch your robe tighter when that attractive neighbour waves at you. Because now you know what's at stake. Not just sin, not just hell, but that hell, the one you can picture down to the colour of the flames and the look of pure glee on a demon's face. And once those images are in your head, they don't leave. That's the genius of it, really. You carry them with you, to bed, to church, to every moment of temptation. The church didn't need to follow you home. It just had to make sure the art did. Okay, you've accepted that demons might visit you in your sleep, that your dreams are probably sinful, and that if you so much as think a naughty thought, you'll end up getting publicly roasted in some fresco somewhere. Fine, but surely if you're married and following the rules, sex is finally safe. Right? Wrong. Because here's the thing the medieval church loved to remind you. Even married sex could still be a sin. Let that sink in. You're doing everything right. Ceremony, vows, mutual consent, trying for kids, and you can still end up on the church's naughty list if your intentions aren't pure enough. If that doesn't make your eye twitch, you haven't been paying attention. The root of this paranoia, again, lies in the belief that desire itself is inherently disordered. Marriage is merely a workaround, a spiritual duct tape solution. The church didn't celebrate marital sex as a blessing. It tolerated it. Barely. And only because Augustine said it was a necessary concession to human weakness. Left unchecked, your desire would run wild and marriage was there to fence it in. But offence isn't a blessing, it's a warning. In theory, marital sex was only okay under 3 conditions. First, it had to be open to procreation. No blocking or dodging allowed. Second, it had to be within the bounds of monogamy and fidelity. Fair enough. And third, and this is where things get murky, it had to be done without excessive enjoyment. That's right. You weren't allowed to want it too much, even with your own spouse. If pleasure was your primary motive, you were teetering into sinful territory. If you finished and felt a little too satisfied, better hit the confessional. Let's break that down. You could be married, trying for a baby, and still commit sin if your heart wasn't perfectly aligned with your holy purpose. And if both partners just really genuinely wanted each other, that mutual desire was suspect. It wasn't pure, it was indulgent. And indulgence was a moral red flag. Naturally, this led to some truly awkward situations. Medieval confessors had to assess the motivations of married couples, something that sounds more like an intrusive therapy session than spiritual guidance. Some priests used confession guides like penitentials, which laid out detailed flowcharts for sin classification. They asked questions like, did you have sex during a holy day? Did you do it too often? Did you enjoy it too much? Was your spouse menstruating? Was it Sunday? These weren't rare inquiries. They were expected. The real kicker? There wasn't even agreement on how often was too often. Some medieval manuals suggested that sex more than once a week was excessive. Others were a bit more generous, twice a week maybe, but every manual came with a heaping dose of guilt. The more frequent the sex, the more penance you owed. In some cases, priests would assign days of fasting or prayer based on how lustfully you'd performed your marital duties. And let's not ignore the emotional toll. You're trying to live a faithful life, but every attempt to express love physically could land you in spiritual hot water. You couldn't even say I love you without mentally checking yourself. Do I love them too much? Do I desire them more than I desire God? Is my marriage leading me to holiness or dragging me toward hell with every kiss? You know, just casual questions to ponder while folding the laundry. Even the timing of marital sex was heavily policed. Entire chunks of the calendar were blocked off. No sex during Lent, or Advent, or on Fridays, or Sundays, or on the eve of communion, or during a saint's feast day. Depending on where you lived and how strictly you followed church teachings, that could eliminate up to half the year. And don't even think about it if one of you was sick, travelling, or in a state of ritual impurity, a vague term usually applied to women, surprise, surprise. What's bizarre is that despite all this, people still found ways to love each other. They still flirted, still made jokes, still shared beds and moments of intimacy, but they did it with a cloud over their heads. Every kiss was a question. Every touch came with a whisper of guilt. You weren't just worried about sin, you were worried about being seen. If your neighbour heard too much laughter from your house, it might spark a rumour. And rumours had a way of turning into penance. Of course, not all church leaders were equally strict. There were some more lenient voices, priests and theologians who believed that marital love, expressed joyfully, was part of God's design. But those views were often smothered by louder, harsher voices. The stricter your teaching, the more authority you seemed to carry. Fear spread faster than grace, and though more a preacher emphasized damnation, the more devout he appeared. Here's a quirky detail for you. Some monks believed that even within marriage, sex could open a gateway for demons. If you gave into desire, even in a legal context, you could weaken your spiritual defences. One Benedictine chronicler wrote that the devil lurked near the beds of newlyweds, hoping to catch them in a moment of indulgence and mark their souls. Romantic, right? Talk about a mood killer. Meanwhile, scholars today still debate how much of this was enforced versus simply taught. Was the average medieval couple really checking the liturgical calendar before getting busy? Probably not, but the fear was real, the guilt was real, and more importantly, the idea of sin was planted so deeply that even if no one was watching, your own conscience might be. That's the genius of it all. The church didn't need to peek into your bedroom. It just needed to make sure you took the guilt with you. That way you'd do the work for them. You'd internalize the judgment. You'd second-guess your own feelings. You'd police yourself. So here you are, married and faithful, but still walking on theological eggshells. You try to love your spouse without loving them too much. You try to enjoy closeness without slipping into excessive pleasure. You keep the rules in your head like a playlist you never asked for. Timing, intention, frequency, purity. And the worst part, If you mess up, you might not even know it. You could go to bed thinking you're just being a good partner and wake up with a gnawing feeling that you've accidentally insulted God. Because in the Middle Ages, love doesn't free you from sin. Sometimes it's just the prettiest cage of all. At this point, you're walking through life like a tightrope act with no net, balancing desire, guilt, piety, and a rotating calendar of spiritual landmines. You've accepted that even in marriage, sex is a dicey proposition. But just when you think you've mapped out the church's labyrinth of sexual do's and don'ts, you're hit with another medieval twist. There are whole periods of the year when sex isn't just frowned upon, it's outright banned. Not by law, but by religion. Welcome to the holy minefield of fasting from flesh, and yes, that includes both the dinner plate and the bed. Here's how it works. You're living in a time when the church controls the calendar. Not just feast days and saints' days, but entire seasons of spiritual focus. Lent, for example, is a 40-day period leading up to Easter. Advent is the 4 weeks before Christmas. Both are times of penance and restraint, and during those weeks, the rules get stricter. Meat is off the table, alcohol's discouraged. Laughter, music, and celebration, toned down, and sex, absolutely not. Even if you're married, even if you're discreet, even if you swear you're doing it to make a baby. Too bad, you fast and that includes your body. But it doesn't stop there. Fridays were considered penitential days year-round. Sundays were too holy for bodily indulgence. Then you've got Ember Days, quarterly. 3-day fasts, the eves of major feast days, no sex, the 12 days of Christmas. Mixed messages. The night before communion, definitely not. When you add it all up, almost half the medieval calendar was considered inappropriate for sexual activity. So picture yourself trying to keep track of this. You're exhausted from work, your kids are loud, the weather's cold, and you'd like to share a little warmth with your spouse. But wait, check the calendar. Is it Lent? Is tomorrow the feast of Saint something? Is it Wednesday? Are you within the postpartum purification period? Has your spouse been to confession? Is the moon in the wrong phase? You start to wonder if there's ever a good time. To make matters worse, the church didn't just ban sex during these seasons, they moralized it. If you broke the rule, you weren't just indulging a forbidden pleasure, you were defiling a sacred time. There's an old saying that whoever sins during Lent sins double. Medieval confessors believed that spiritual focus was most vulnerable during times of expected purity. If you gave in, even a little, it was seen as spitting in the face of God's grace. This wasn't just about discipline, it was about control. The church was teaching you to shape your entire life, eating, sleeping and sexing around the rhythm of its authority. You couldn't be trusted to govern your body on your own, so the calendar did it for you. And people took it seriously. There were stories of couples who confessed in tears that they'd given in to temptation during a fast period. Some went on pilgrimage to make up for it. Others performed public penance, walking barefoot, wearing sackcloth or fasting from food altogether. Because what's better than fasting from sex? Fasting from everything. And if you think this only applied to common folk, think again. Nobles and royals were expected to set the standard. There's a recorded instance of a queen being reprimanded for conceiving a child during Lent. Never mind that the church needed royal heirs, it was more concerned that she'd broken the sacred calendar. Your status didn't buy you exemption. In fact, it made you more visible, and therefore more judged. Let's talk about Lent specifically, because it was the church's MVP of sexual restriction. Lent wasn't just about giving up meat or sugar, it was about purification, a complete emptying of the flesh. Priests reminded their flocks that Christ had fasted in the desert, and now it was your turn. If Christ could deny himself food, water and comfort, the least you could do was keep your pants on until Easter. And in the eyes of the church, sex, even married sex, was an indulgence too far. And then there's the fascinating parallel between meat and flesh. The word flesh in Latin, caro, referred both to meat and the body. So fasting from flesh had a double meaning. You gave up meat to discipline your stomach and gave up sex to discipline your soul. It was about aligning your will with God's. Desire was a kind of hunger, and the church wanted you to feel it, but not satisfy it. Here's a fringe fun fact. There were actual debates among theologians about whether breaking sexual fasts invalidated other religious observances. Like, if you had sex on a Lenten Friday, did your entire fast reset? Did your prayers still count? Was it worse if you enjoyed it, or if you initiated it? These were not hypothetical questions. Monks wrote full commentaries on them. Your immortal soul might hinge on whether your midnight romp happened before or after the rooster crowed. Of course, real life rarely matched the ideal. People slipped up. Some ignored the rules entirely, especially in rural areas where church oversight was limited. Others just hoped their confessor was lenient. There are records of priests who rolled their eyes and offered mild penance, 3 Hail Marys and a firm reminder to behave. But the guilt lingered. Whether or not you were punished, you carried the fear. And the gender politics? Oh, you bet they showed up. Men were usually assumed to be the instigators of desire, so if a wife resisted sex during a forbidden period and the husband insisted, the sin was his. But if a woman initiated, it raised eyebrows. It was seen as especially scandalous, even deviant. Her desire was treated like a breach of nature, something unnatural, something threatening. So while the rulebook applied to both genders, the weight of shame wasn't always evenly distributed. And here's the big irony. All this effort to control sex during sacred seasons had the unintended effect of making sex more powerful. It turned physical intimacy into forbidden fruit, heightening the allure. People fantasized about what they weren't allowed to do. Couples joked, quietly and very carefully, about countdowns to Easter, like some perverse version of Advent calendars. And the more the church said no, the more the body whispered yes. So now you're living inside a clock that isn't ticking toward pleasure, it's ticking toward restraint. You mark your days not by what you're looking forward to, but by what you're forbidden from doing. The church has its hands on the dials of your desire, and the calendar is a cage disguised as a blessing. And yet somehow love persists. Desire leaks through the cracks. People steal kisses in fields, whisper in pews, and count the days until they're allowed to touch again. Because in a world this restricted, even the simplest pleasures feel like miracles. If there's one person you're supposed to admire in the medieval world, one untouchable symbol of purity and perfection, it's Mary. Not your neighbour Mary with the loud chickens, the Mary, the Virgin, the Mother of God, the woman who somehow gave birth while staying chaste, glowing with holiness, untouched by even the smallest drop of sin. In a time when the church was obsessed with controlling sexuality, Mary was their shining example of what a woman should be. Fertile but never lustful, nurturing but never sensual, a womb without desire. Welcome to the era of the virgin cult, where the ideal woman is one who never had sex and never wanted to. From the 12th century onward, the veneration of Mary explodes like incense smoke in a packed cathedral. She becomes more than just a biblical figure. She becomes a standard, the standard. Statues of her multiply, hymns are composed, miracle stories grow like ivy and cathedrals rise in her name. She is not just the mother of Christ, she's the spiritual mother of everyone. And unlike Eve, who ruined everything by listening to a serpent and getting curious, Mary redeems humanity by saying yes to God while keeping her body on holy lockdown. Now let's be honest. The biology here is, well, miraculous. Mary conceives Jesus without sexual contact. She remains a virgin before, during and after childbirth. Don't ask how, it's considered a mystery, and not the kind you're allowed to puzzle over. In fact, church doctrine insists that the birth of Christ left her physically untouched, like light passing through glass. It's not just symbolic purity, it's anatomical. And that idea gets traction. Artists start showing Mary in pristine white robes, always surrounded by lilies, the official flower of virginity, untouched by dirt or age. She's often portrayed sitting calmly in a cathedral-like structure, emphasizing her role as the new ark, sacred, sealed and perfect. Her expression is serene, distant. She rarely looks at the viewer. She's maternal without ever being earthy. If she has a body, it's only so she can say no to it. This purity becomes an anchor for all medieval ideas about female virtue. Women are told, explicitly and repeatedly, that Mary is their role model, which sounds fine until you realise the implications. You, as a medieval woman, are expected to embody her virtues: obedience, modesty, silence, and of course chastity. But you'll never be Mary. You're a fallen daughter of Eve by default. The best you can do is try to imitate her, and feel terrible when you fail. Meanwhile, the church develops a sort of cosmic contrast between Eve and Mary. Eve is the reason sin entered the world. Mary is the reason salvation enters it. Eve said yes to temptation. Mary says yes to obedience. Eve's desire breaks paradise. Mary's denial restores it. It's like a theological two-woman show, except one is eternally blamed and the other eternally praised. And you're stuck somewhere in between, reminded at every turn that your body could lean either way. Here's a quirky side note. Some medieval theologians debated whether Mary could have felt sexual desire and simply resisted it. Others insisted she was so pure that the concept of lust never even occurred to her. This was a hot theological question, not whether she had sex, everyone agreed she didn't, but whether she had to fight the urge like the rest of us. The gentler version of the story says no. She was naturally inclined toward purity without struggle, which of course made her even harder to relate to. And this is where the virgin cult becomes less about Mary herself and more about social control. Her image is used to shame and shape real women. Sermons tell wives to behave like Mary. Girls are taught to guard their virginity as the most precious part of themselves, not just for God, but for their families. A daughter's purity is often directly linked to a family's honour. In some cases, losing your virginity outside of marriage, even by force, could ruin your future. Your value was tied to your virtue, and your virtue meant one thing: not having sex. In the convents, Mary's influence takes on another shape. Nuns are called brides of Christ, and their vows of chastity are modelled after her eternal virginity. Some write love letters to Jesus, describing spiritual marriages with divine grooms who never touch. Mary is their queen, their mother, and their unreachable goal. The holiest women are those who renounce flesh completely, not just in deed, but in desire. To feel longing is human, to suppress it, divine, but not everyone finds comfort in Mary's glow. There's a quiet, growing frustration, especially among women who don't fit the mould. Widows, for example, often occupy a strange liminal space. They're no longer virgins, but they're expected not to remarry or express interest in men. They're encouraged to live like Mary, even though their bodies say otherwise. Young wives feel torn between pleasing their husbands and aspiring to an ideal that demands emotional detachment. Even pregnant women, clearly partaking in the messy business of sex, are surrounded by icons of a mother who bore a child without ever knowing a man. It creates a tension that's impossible to resolve. Artists sometimes wrestled with this tension too. In some paintings, Mary looks painfully remote, more goddess than woman. In others, you see tiny cracks of realism, a hand resting on her swollen belly, a faint expression of weariness, a moment of closeness with the infant Christ. But those are exceptions. The dominant image is still called perfection. She's what every woman is supposed to be, and what no woman can achieve. And this impossible ideal didn't just affect women. Men were also taught to see women through this lens. A virtuous woman was one who acted like Mary, modest, quiet, clean, obedient. If a woman failed to meet that standard, she was Eve, temptress, dangerous, lustful. It was all or nothing, virgin or whore. There was no middle ground. This binary shaped relationships, expectations, even the law. Women accused of sexual misconduct were judged not just by what they did, but by how well they lived up to Mary's image. Did they dress modestly, speak softly, avoid male company? If not, any accusation carried more weight. You were guilty by association with Eve. And yet, despite all this pressure, people still clung to Mary. She was their intercessor, their comfort, the one person they could pray to who might understand what it meant to be vulnerable. In some folk traditions, Mary becomes more human. She appears in dreams, weeps with peasants, blesses childbirths. But even then, she's still a virgin, always pure, always just out of reach. So now you live in a world where the highest standard for womanhood is someone who never had sex, never wanted to, and still became the most important mother in history. You pray to her, you sing to her, you try to be like her. And every time you feel desire, stumble in love, or simply wish you could be yourself for 5 minutes, you're reminded that your body is not the blueprint. Hers is, and hers is untouched. So you're all trying to follow the rules, confess your impure thoughts, avoid the occasional succubus, and worship a virgin who somehow mothered the Saviour without ever ruffling her robes. But deep down, something's itching at you. You're starting to wonder if sex is so spiritually risky, and even marriage doesn't fully shield you from sin. Is the only truly safe route just not doing it at all? And bingo, that's exactly what the medieval church had been quietly suggesting all along. Because while marriage was tolerated, celibacy was glorified, and those who gave up sex altogether, they were the real VIPs of salvation. Welcome to the world of monks, nuns, and holy ascetics, the eunuchs for heaven. It starts with a line from the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus says, "There are those who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven." Now, that's almost certainly a metaphor, but in medieval Europe, metaphor had a way of morphing into practice. The idea wasn't just to abstain from sex, it was to reject sexuality as a concept. The most devout Christians were those who renounced the flesh entirely. No marriage, no touching, no accidents in the night. Just prayer, poverty, obedience, and sons. Monks and nuns were seen as the spiritual elite, not because they were more intelligent or holy by default, but because they turned their backs on the very thing that tied everyone else to sin, the body. They were married to Christ, and like any good medieval marriage, that came with strict expectations. Any desire was to be crushed, any physical reaction suppressed. The ideal monk or nun wasn't just celibate, they were disembodied, like angels in robes. But achieving this state wasn't as simple as putting on a hood and locking a door. The body, stubborn creature that it is, doesn't just stop wanting things because you decided to be holy. That's why medieval monastic life involved a constant barrage of spiritual and physical disciplines. Fasting, isolation, prayer at ungodly hours, and the occasional self-flagellation just to keep the libido in check. Yes, people actually whipped themselves, not just for punishment, but to suppress desire. Because pain, according to the logic, was a great way to silence pleasure. Some took it even further. There are stories, admittedly fringe but well documented, of men who castrated themselves out of devotion. One monk, Saint Pelagius of Cordova, was rumoured to have torn his own body apart rather than give in to lustful thoughts. Another, Saint Benedict, threw himself into a thorn bush to stop his desires. Extreme? Absolutely. But these stories were passed down as inspiration. These weren't horror tales, they were success stories. Tales of men and women who had tamed the beast within, who had mortified the flesh and risen above it. And it wasn't just men doing this. Women in convents were often held to the same and sometimes stricter standards. Nuns wore coarse robes, shaved their heads, and slept in communal dormitories with strict curfews. No mirrors, no perfume, no singing anything but hymns. Some communities wouldn't even allow hugging, even in grief, desire, even emotional desire was suspect. The goal wasn't just physical virginity, it was complete detachment. What's interesting is how this played out socially. People looked up to monks and nuns not just for their piety, but for their supposed freedom from temptation. They were seen as spiritual warriors, doing battle daily with the devil himself, armed with prayer beads and an unshakable disdain for bodily urges. Families would boast if they had a child in a monastery. Some would donate land or money in exchange for the privilege of having a son or daughter renounce the world. It wasn't just a sacrifice, it was a social flex. And in case you were wondering, yes, there was plenty of religious literature romanticising this. Hymns, prayers and hagiographies, basically Saint fanfiction, describe pure souls who are white lilies among thorns, untouched by corruption and souses of the Lamb. That last one's a favourite. Monks and nuns were imagined as mystical brides and grooms of Christ, their union celebrated not with wine and dancing but with vows of silence and self-denial. It's like a wedding, except no one gets to touch anyone. Ever. But here's the twist. For all their reputation, monastic communities weren't exactly free from scandal. Historical records are full of, let's say, spiritual inconsistencies. There were monks who snuck out at night, nuns who gave birth in secret, entire convents that were shut down after accusations of carnal activity, and every time one of these stories broke, the public went wild. Because deep down, everyone knew how hard it was to shut off the body. You can wall yourself up in stone, but your mind doesn't follow orders so easily. That's the contradiction at the heart of this whole system. The Church elevated celibacy as the highest form of holiness, but the human body refused to play along, and so fear returned. If monks and nuns, the chosen ones, could still stumble, what hope did the rest of us have? Their failures weren't just scandals, they were reminders that desire was universal, insidious, and almost impossible to conquer. This brings us to one of the most open debates among modern scholars. Was celibacy really about holiness? Or was it about power? By encouraging people to give up family, land and inheritance, the Church gained control. A monk with no wife or children was wholly devoted to the institution. A nun in a cloister was removed from society and therefore safe. Some argue that elevating celibacy wasn't about sanctity at all. It was about keeping the church at the centre of your life. No distractions, no heirs, just you and your soul, owned by God and managed by the clergy. Of course, the average medieval person didn't see it this way. They genuinely revered monks and nuns, and many of those who entered the cloisters did so with sincere hearts. Some found peace, some found purpose, a few even found joy, but the system they lived in was built on the same shaky foundation, that sex, even in thought, was a threat, that desire, even if never acted upon, was an infection, and that the only way to win was not to play. So now you, the ordinary sinner, walk past a monastery and feel the sting of inadequacy. These people have given up everything. They pray while you're trying to sneak kisses behind the barn. They sleep on straw while you're wondering if it's a feast day or a fast day. They are the elite. You are just human, and no matter how faithful you try to be, your desire drags you back down again and again. You start to wonder, maybe love is too messy. Maybe the body really is a curse. Maybe salvation belongs only to those who've stopped feeling altogether. Let's say you're a traveller now. You've made your way to a different village, maybe for trade or pilgrimage, and you step into a new church to say your prayers. At first it's quiet, peaceful. Sunlight slants through stained glass windows and flickers over the wooden pews. But then you look up, past the altar, past the hanging incense burners, and you spot a strange scene painted across the wall. A naked figure, bound in chains, surrounded by flames. A snarling demon yanks something from between their legs. Another figure screams as a serpent coils around their hips. Everywhere you look, there are bodies in agony, their punishments horrifyingly specific. This isn't just a general hell, it's anatomical damnation. Welcome to the medieval church's most explicit classroom, the doctrine of hell's anatomy lesson. You see, it wasn't enough for the church to say that sexual sin led to punishment. They had to show you exactly how it worked, where your sins would hurt and why. And in these vivid hellscapes, every part of the body was a target, especially the parts you were already taught to fear. Genitals, mouths, breasts, eyes. They were punished in kind. If you sinned with it, the demons used it against you. Justice wasn't just poetic, it was graphic, unflinching, and disturbingly personal. These depictions weren't hidden in the back corners of chapels either. They were often front and centre, high on the walls carved into columns, or splayed across massive wooden panels behind the altar. The most famous example, the Last Judgment fresco in the Sistine Chapel's predecessor, and countless others inspired by it. Christ sits calmly in the centre, dividing souls. On one side, the blessed float upward in flowing robes. On the other, the damned fall into pits of fire, some being chewed, flayed or speared, right in the parts they used improperly in life. The message was crystal clear. Your body remembers what you did, and so does hell. Take the example of the lectus Christ versus, carved into the tympanum of a 12th century French church. He's depicted being devoured groin first by monstrous beasts, eyes wide in terror. Why? Because he gave in to desire. The artist didn't bother with subtlety. In fact, the whole sculpture reads like a warning label, do not attempt to enjoy yourself. And it worked. These images terrified people into obedience, or at least into silence, and this wasn't limited to stone and paint. Manuscripts, those painstakingly hand-copied books filled with gold leaf and holy wisdom, also joined the anatomical horror show. In the margins of otherwise holy texts, you'd find drawings of demons fondling sinners, women being chased by hybrid monsters, men strapped to torture wheels with obvious symbolism involving their lower halves. It was like a medieval meme format, except instead of jokes, you got genital mutilation and spiritual doom. Why so detailed? Because fear needs specifics. The vaguer the threat, the easier it is to ignore. But show someone their own anatomy twisted and scorched for eternity, and suddenly every choice matters. The church wanted your conscience not just activated, it wanted it haunted. You were supposed to remember these images the next time you found your thoughts drifting toward temptation. The art became a second skin, clinging to your imagination, flashing behind your eyes when you were alone. What makes it even more intense is the almost obsessive symmetry of sin and punishment. Did you sin with your eyes? Your eyes are plucked out. With your mouth? Your tongue is burned or torn. With your hands? They're flayed or nailed. And for sexual sin, of which there are many, including lust, adultery, fornication, masturbation, and even excessive marital desire, the punishments were almost always focused on the genitals. Some were stabbed, others boiled, some bitten by animals or stung by insects. There's an entire illustrated manuscript that shows a line of souls walking toward hell, each being punished in the exact way they sinned. It reads like a spiritual horror show designed by a sadistic anatomy teacher. Of course, scholars debate how literal these images were meant to be. Some argue they were symbolic, visual metaphors for internal suffering. Others say the church fully intended them to be read as literal previews. And honestly, for the average medieval person who couldn't read Latin and had never seen a medical textbook, these images were truth. They didn't see art. They saw warnings. And if you were a woman, the stakes were even higher. Female anatomy was treated with special suspicion. Women's bodies were seen as more vulnerable, more volatile, and more easily corrupted. In some depictions of hell, women are dragged by their breasts, pierced through their wombs, or burned in the areas that caused men to sin. Even being desirable was dangerous. A beautiful woman could be blamed for the sins of others. If she tempted a man, even unintentionally, she was sometimes painted as equally guilty. This is how the church weaponized anatomy, turning your very form into a potential curse. But the grotesqueness didn't stay confined to murals and manuscripts. It spilled into sermons too. Preachers would stand before terrified congregations and describe these punishments in brutal detail, often building the scene slowly, flesh burning, teeth gnashing, so screams echoing into the void. And they'd always bring it back home. This could be you. Maybe not today, maybe not next year. But if you die in sin, your body becomes your prison. Forever. Here's a creepy fringe fact. Some penitential manuals gave priests instructions on how to describe hell to children. Yes, children. The idea was to start the fear young, plant the seeds early. One guide suggested comparing the flames of hell to a hot iron pulled from the hearth. Another advised telling boys that if they touch themselves, serpents shall come forth from your loins and devour you. Sweet dreams, little Thomas. And let's not pretend this didn't work. These images carved themselves into the culture. They showed up in popular songs, folk stories, and even jokes. Pilgrims would travel miles to visit churches with especially vivid Last Judgment scenes. Parents used them as behaviour tools. Eat your vegetables, or the devil will roast your tongue. It sounds absurd now, but in a world with no therapy, no internet, and no alternative narratives, this was your moral universe. It's easy to roll your eyes at this now, to see it as over-the-top scare tactics, but it was deeply effective and devastating. Because once you believe your own body is a ticking time bomb of sin, you never truly feel safe. Not in bed, not in prayer, not even in your own skin. The church didn't need to invent new punishments. It just had to convince you that your body would betray you. And every time you looked at those walls, those flames, those snarling demon faces, well, that conviction only deepened. So now, whether you're a wandering merchant or a lifelong villager, you carry the image of hell inside you. You see it every time your gaze lingers too long. You feel it every time desire stirs. You try to resist, not just because it's right, but because somewhere in your imagination is a clawed hand waiting to punish exactly the part of you that betrayed your soul. You've grown up with fire at your back. Literal fire, in the case of those hellish murals, and metaphorical fire every time your desires flare up. You've heard the rules, seen the punishments carved in stone, and sat through enough confessions to memorize the script. But just when you think the church has exhausted its arsenal of fear tactics, here come the sermons, long, loud theatrical performances designed not to instruct, but to terrify you straight. Welcome to the sacred theatre of Doomsday Dirty Talk, where every Sunday is Judgment Day, and your body is always on the chopping block. Let's set the scene. It's Sunday morning and you're in your local parish church, packed in shoulder to shoulder with the rest of your village. The smell of damp wool, wood smoke and nervous sweat is heavy in the air. The priest steps up to the pulpit, maybe barefoot, maybe shouting Latin phrases you don't understand, and suddenly, it's not a sermon. It's an apocalyptic horror monologue. There's no gentle wisdom here, no soft encouragement. This is a verbal whip. And you, sitting wide-eyed in the pew, are the target. The style. Think medieval stand-up comedy, if the jokes were all about burning in hell. These sermons were performative, dramatic, and meticulously graphic. Preachers didn't just warn you about lust. They walked you through what it would feel like to be punished for it. In detail, the worms gnawing your genitals, the eternal flame licking the soft insides of your thighs, the demons who'd use your own sinful body as a tool of torment. It was like a horror audiobook, but live and personalised. This was especially common during Advent and Lent, the two penitential seasons where reflection and guilt were cranked up to 11. It wasn't unusual for priests to deliver fire and brimstone sermons every single day leading up to Easter. Entire weeks were dedicated to hammering home one message: your desires are your downfall, and your soul is hanging by a thread. One of the all-time greats, and by great we mean utterly terrifying, was Berthold of Regensburg, a 13th century German preacher who toured towns and villages like a one-man travelling doomsday machine. His sermons were legendary for their intensity. He would pace, gesture wildly, shout, weep, and sometimes even collapse dramatically to the floor, just to drive home how awful your afterlife was going to be if you didn't confess every last lustful thought. Crowds loved him. They cried, fainted, repented in droves. Medieval TED Talk energy, but with more brimstone. And there was no safe zone. Even your thoughts weren't off limits. Preachers regularly warned that thinking about sex was just as damning as doing it. And of course those thoughts could sneak in at any time, during Mass, during meals, during other sermons. You could be guilty while listening to someone explain why you're guilty. That's a moral paradox designed to keep you locked in place. And it worked. There are documented cases of people collapsing in fits of terror during sermons, convinced they were going to hell on the spot. Some tried to confess mid-sermon. Others crawled on their knees down the church aisle begging for absolution. One legend tells of a man who burst into tears during a sermon about lust, ran out into the street, and joined a monastery on the same day. Say what you will about fear-based education, it got results. But here's the darker side. These sermons didn't just instill fear. They shaped your inner voice. Over time, the preacher's warnings became your own self-talk. You didn't need the priest to say, "That thought is sinful." You already knew. You'd heard it 100 times, seen the illustrations, memorized the punishments. Your conscience didn't whisper anymore. It shouted. The church had successfully colonized your imagination. Of course, not all sermons were this intense. Some priests took a gentler approach, emphasizing God's mercy and forgiveness. But even those sermons were often followed up by a reminder. You still have to confess everything, and soon, because death could come at any moment. Plague, fire, war, childbirth, infection, your soul needed to be in a constant state of readiness. Oh, Tena. And your body? Always suspect. And the star of every sermon? The Last Judgment. That looming cosmic finale where Christ returns to separate the saved from the damned. You've seen it painted above church doors, now you get to hear it described in surround sound. And yes, sex gets a starring role in the downfall of mankind. The priest will explain, sometimes tearfully, that the fires of hell are hottest for the lustful, that angels will turn their faces away from those who touch themselves, that no secret is secret to God. Especially not that one. Here's a fringe detail you'll love. Some preachers actually used props. One 14th century sermon in Paris involved a priest holding up a fake flaming phallus carved from wood. Yes, you heard that right. While describing the punishments awaiting lustful men. Another carried a sack filled with live snakes and eels, hissing and squirming as he walked the aisles, saying, "This is what awaits the impure." Theatre kids had nothing on medieval clergy. These moments left scars. People would carry the images in their heads for life. Some would hear a particular phrase, "The fire of your loins shall become your tomb," and replay it for decades. Others developed intense fear of intimacy, even in marriage. There are records of women who refused to consummate their marriages for years out of terror, and men who confessed phantom sins, convinced that a lustful dream or thought had already sealed their fate. Now you might wonder, were these sermons truly effective? Did they change behaviour, or just traumatize people into silence? Scholars are still debating that. Some argue that fear kept communities morally aligned, prevented sexual chaos, and preserved social order. Others suggest it backfired, that it created a culture of hypocrisy and repression, where everyone pretended to be chaste while quietly burning inside. What's certain is that the fear itself became part of religious devotion. To feel terrified of your own body, That was seen as proof you were spiritually aware. If you weren't afraid, you weren't holy enough. The more ashamed you were, the closer you were to grace. It was a closed loop, a holy trap. Fear led to confession, which led to temporary relief, which inevitably circled back to fear. Wash, rinse, repeat, forever. So now you leave Mass not just spiritually rattled, but physically uneasy. The words from the pulpit echo in your ears. You clutch your coat tighter. You avoid eye contact with the person walking beside you. You try to keep your thoughts clean, your body quiet, your heart still. Because if there's one thing the church has taught you week after week, it's this: desire is death. So you've survived the sermons, the murals, the calendar of banned nights, and your own guilty conscience. You've probably confessed more imaginary sins than real ones, and your dreams? Still questionable. But now something changes. The fear isn't just coming from inside anymore. It's starting to wear a new face, a woman's face. And that face, the church decides, might just belong to a witch. Because in a world where lust is sin and women are blamed for awakening it, what happens when female desire can't be controlled? It gets labelled supernatural, and suddenly the village sweetheart becomes a vessel of Satan. Welcome to the terrifying crossover episode where witch hunts meet wet dreams. The idea of the witch didn't come out of nowhere. Long before the 15th century, there were whispered stories of women who consorted with demons, cooked up love potions, or danced naked in the woods under a blood moon. Harmless folklore, right? Wrong. As the church's grip tightened and the fear of sin grew sharper, these whispers began to sound like threats. And the biggest threat of all? Sexual power. Especially if it was in the hands of a woman. You've already heard that women were considered more susceptible to sin. Theologians like Augustine and Jerome couldn't write 3 sentences without reminding everyone that Eve was the first sinner. But by the late Middle Ages, this general unease curdled into full-blown panic. Women weren't just tempting, they were agents of temptation. They didn't just fall into sin, they spread it. And what better scapegoat than the woman who dared to embrace her sexuality? The church began to teach that some women had voluntarily given themselves to demons, that they didn't just suffer temptation, they enjoyed it. The Malleus Maleficarum, written in 487 by 2 Dominican inquisitors, laid it out in chilling detail. This massive how-to manual for hunting witches argued that women were more carnal, more emotional, and therefore more likely to make pacts with the devil. And these weren't just deals for power or wealth. No, according to the Malleus, most witches sought demonic lovers, yes, demons, as in literal creatures from hell. The belief was that these women, young, old, widowed, lonely, were seduced by the devil himself, often in the form of a man. Or worse, they seduced the demons. The sex, according to court testimonies and tortured confessions, was often described as violent, addictive, and shamefully pleasurable. Which, if you squint, sounds a lot like the church projecting its fear of female autonomy and eroticism onto a mythic scapegoat. And it wasn't just abstract paranoia. These accusations got people killed. Thousands of women across Europe were accused of witchcraft, tortured until they confessed a carnal congress with Satan, and then executed, often by fire. And while the charges varied, sexual misconduct was almost always part of the package. If you were seen as too attractive, too flirtatious, too independent, too weird, you were suspect. A single rumour, she walks alone at night, or she doesn't want a husband, could snowball into an accusation of orgies with incubi. But the fear cut both ways. Men were warned that witches could steal their seed in the night, curse their manhood, or enchant them with just a glance. And suddenly, any inexplicable desire became someone else's fault. Did you have an erotic dream? Maybe a witch sent it. Did you feel overwhelmed with lust at a festival? Must have been a potion. This paranoia gave men a convenient way to dodge guilt. If they failed at chastity, it wasn't weakness, it was witchcraft. Here's a bizarre fringe belief. Some theologians claimed witches kept the severed penises of their lovers in boxes or tree hollows. No, really. They believed a woman could collect male organs as trophies, animate them with spells, and even feed them like pets. This kind of nightmarish folklore wasn't just late-night tavern talk. It ended up in official court records. Why? Because it captured exactly what the church feared most: female control over male desire. And let's be clear, this wasn't about real women flying on broomsticks or dancing with goats. It was about control. The church saw that some women had learned to navigate the cracks in the system. Widows who ran businesses, midwives who had herbal knowledge, unmarried women who lived alone. These weren't witches, they were independent. And in a society built around hierarchy and obedience, independence was deeply threatening. Sexual independence? Even worse. So the church wrapped its fears in theology and folklore. They turned the sexually confident woman into a monster, a seductress with supernatural backing. And in doing so, they didn't just punish desire, they criminalized it. You couldn't just feel ashamed of your sexuality. Now you had to fear your neighbors. You had to wonder if the girl who smiled at you in the marketplace was trying to enchant you, or if the herbs your aunt gave you for cramps were actually spells. This created an environment of constant suspicion, especially for women. If you were too pretty, you were suspicious. If you were plain but confident, even worse. If you were single past a certain age, dangerous. Married and childless, definitely unnatural. No matter what you did, you were vulnerable to judgment. Because in the eyes of the church, the female body was a battleground, and if that body wasn't controlled by a husband or a convent, it might already belong to the devil. Of course, not everyone believed this. There were skeptics, even some priests, who argued that witchcraft accusations were often baseless, driven by jealousy or fear. But the system had momentum. It fed on spectacle. Trials were public, executions were performances, and when people watched a witch burn, they weren't just purging a sinner. They were reaffirming the rules. Women must be silent, submissive, and most importantly, sexless. The tragedy of it all is that the women who ended up accused were rarely dangerous. They were healers, caretakers, misfits, or just unlucky. But in a culture where sexual fear ran so deep, any deviation was suspicious. The church had spent centuries teaching people that the body was dangerous, that women were weak, and that lust was demonic. Witch hunts were the logical conclusion. So now you live in a village where sex isn't just risky, it's a potential death sentence. Not for you necessarily, but for the person who caused it. You feel desire, and suddenly you're not just sinful, you're in danger, because someone might think you are enchanted. Or worse, that you're the one casting spells, that your pleasure isn't just immoral, it's illegal, and punishable by... And if you're a woman, you learn to keep your eyes down, your voice soft, your body small, because in a world like this, even your longing can be used against you. So now, sleep doesn't even feel safe. You're keeping your head down during the day to avoid catching blame, and at night the church tells you something might be climbing into bed with you. You're alone, under scratchy wool blankets in a creaky wooden room with the wind howling outside, and if you dare wake up flustered and breathless, well, that wasn't a dream, that was a succubus, or an incubus depending on who you are. In the Middle Ages, the body was already your enemy, but now the church insists you're not even alone in it. Welcome to the deeply bizarre, wildly unsettling world of demonic sex creatures. Let's start with the basics. According to medieval belief, succubi were female demons who seduced men in their sleep. They were said to be beautiful, irresistible, and unusually talented in the bedroom, which made them doubly dangerous. Once they lured a man into intercourse, again typically in his dreams, they would either drain his life force or steal his seed to pass on to their male counterparts, the incubi, who'd then use it to impregnate women. That's right. Medieval theology had concocted an entire supernatural fertility scam that ran on nocturnal emissions and borrowed sperm. And this wasn't fringe. This wasn't something only superstitious peasants believed while drunk on mead. Theologians wrote about it, doctors debated it, inquisitors asked about it during confessions. You could read descriptions of incubus attacks in treatises, court documents, and sent biographies. If you were suffering from chronic arousal, nighttime emissions, erotic dreams, or even sudden feelings of guilt and confusion, boom! Classic incubus activity. And if you were a woman experiencing similar things, the church had a file open on you too. This belief served multiple purposes. For one, it gave the clergy a clean excuse when things went sideways. You're a priest who's sworn celibacy and wakes up with very unholy evidence in the morning. That wasn't you, it was a demon. The devil sent a succubus to tempt you. She probably looked like your favourite local temptress, just more glowy and mysterious. It's not your fault. It's spiritual warfare. But even for regular folks, the incubus-succubus narrative offered a strange kind of psychological relief. People didn't understand involuntary arousal. Wet dreams, sleep paralysis, sexual fantasies that crept in uninvited And in a world where you were taught that even your thoughts could damn you, the idea that an outside force caused all this was kind of a twisted comfort. A terrifying one, sure, but it was better than thinking your soul was spontaneously leaking sin. Of course, the flip side of that relief was paranoia. Once you believe in these creatures, you start seeing them everywhere. A shiver in the night, a presence in your room, a dream that feels too real. The church said those were signs. Signs that you were being visited, targeted, marked. Some even believed that incubi could develop long-term attachments to their victims, showing up night after night, draining their strength, ruining their chances of salvation. The spiritual version of a toxic ex. Women were especially vulnerable. If you were unmarried and got pregnant, couldn't possibly be a secret lover or, God forbid, consensual pleasure. It must have been an incubus, demonic conception. This story worked well for both terrified girls and ashamed families, and the church was always ready to help. Exorcisms were performed, priests were called, holy water was flung around bedrooms like garlic at a vampire rave. And for many women this wasn't protection, it was another form of humiliation. Now your body wasn't just sinful, it was a portal. And here's a truly bizarre side note. Some theologians debated whether these demons had actual physical bodies or were just borrowing forms. One theory suggested they could take the shape of recently deceased people to make the seduction easier. So if your dead husband suddenly shows up in your dreams looking a little too healthy and suggestive, that's not comfort. That's a demon wearing his face. Good luck sleeping ever again. This fear bled into everything. People slept in groups for protection. They carved crosses into their bedposts. They avoided certain positions when sleeping, on your stomach for example, was considered more inviting. Some tried sleeping with relics under their pillows, or reciting specific prayers before lying down. Entire manuals were written on how to spiritually safeguard your body during the most vulnerable hours of the night. The church had turned dreaming into a full-contact sport with hell. Even saints weren't immune. Stories of holy figures being visited by demons in seductive forms were common. Saint Benedict supposedly rolled in thorns to combat lustful visions. Saint Anthony reported being assaulted by phantoms in the desert. These tales weren't whispered warnings, they were canonized battles. Proof that the fight against desire wasn't just personal, it was cosmic. Even the holy were haunted. Of course, modern scholars tend to interpret all of this a little differently. Some say succubus and incubus stories were just attempts to explain away sleep paralysis, which often comes with a terrifying feeling of pressure on the chest and a sense of being watched. Others suggest it was a coping mechanism for shame. People didn't know how to talk about sexual feelings, so they invented predators to bear the blame. And there's no denying the church leaned into that, because what better way to maintain control than to convince people their own bodies were under siege? And the creepiness doesn't stop with theology. In many witch trials, the accused confessed, usually under torture, that they'd had sex with demons. These weren't metaphorical accounts. Judges wanted specifics. They asked what the demon looked like, how it behaved, whether the sex was painful or pleasurable. The language is disturbing, clinical, and often grotesquely erotic. It's as if the church, in trying to stamp out lust, became obsessed with cataloguing it, lust disguised as law. So now your nights are no longer private. The church has followed you home, crawled under your blankets, and nestled itself into your dreams. You don't just guard your thoughts, you police your fantasies. You wake up sweating and feel shame before you even open your eyes. You wonder, was that dream a sin? Did I just lose ground in my fight for salvation? Should I tell the priest? Would he believe me? Or would he look at me differently forever? Because here's a truly clever trick. Even if you don't believe in succubi or incubi, the fear still works. You still question yourself. You still second-guess your body. And that fear, that anxious, shameful buzz you carry with you, is what the church has always wanted. Not just obedience, not just virtue, control. And so you light a candle before bed, say your prayers, keep your legs together under the sheets, try not to think, try not to feel, try not to want, because in the dark even your own desire might not belong to you anymore. By now, you've internalized the medieval playbook. Your body is dangerous, your thoughts are suspect, and your dreams are potentially demon-infested. You've watched desire get rebranded as a disease, and you've seen the rules twist themselves into impossible shapes. But nothing sums it all up quite like the church's ultimate favourite double standard. The Holy Virgin versus the unholy whore. One woman is untouchable in her purity, the other is dangerous simply for existing. And the space between them, it barely exists at all. Let's start with the obvious. Women in medieval society were divided by a brutal binary. You were either like Mary, the ever-virgin, quiet and glowing and piously unattainable, or you were like Eve, the original seductress, the one who opened the gates of sin with a smile and a piece of fruit. From these two archetypes came every label, every sermon, every social expectation. It wasn't just spiritual, it was cultural law. You could be a virgin or a whore, nothing in between. Of course, most women didn't fit either role perfectly, but try telling that to a society that had turned its spiritual teachings into a form of moral sorting. If you were modest, obedient and quiet, you were closer to the virgin. If you spoke your mind, wore bright colours, or showed interest in a man before marriage, you slid quickly down the purity scale. And if you lost your virginity, by choice or not, it was nearly impossible to reclaim your place. Your value dropped, your status changed, and suddenly your entire identity was up for grabs. Even worse, the church didn't always bother hiding its judgment. Virgin martyrs were glorified, their stories read aloud in church and painted on chapel walls. They died defending their purity, resisting temptation even as they were tortured, mutilated and killed. Saints like Agnes, Catherine and Lucy were canonized for saying no to marriage and yes to martyrdom. Their purity wasn't just admired, it was weaponized. The lesson was simple: better to die than to lose your virginity. No pressure. But what if you didn't want to be a saint? What if you were just a woman trying to live? Well, the moment you stepped outside the boundaries of church-sanctioned behaviour, you risked being cast as the whore. The label didn't require sex work. It didn't even require sex. It just required being noticed. Unmarried and attractive. Suspicious. Talked to too many men? Probably. Corrupt. Had a child outside of marriage? Definitely damned. The church was obsessed with managing female sexuality, and when it couldn't control it, it punished it. The contrast gets even sharper when you look at how male and female sexuality were treated. A man who sinned, say by visiting a brothel or confessing impure thoughts, might be holded, fined, told to fast, but he'd still be considered salvageable, tempted but forgivable. A woman who did the same thing, she was often treated as already lost. There was a belief that women, once they fell, couldn't be fully redeemed. Virginity was like a magical cloak. Once removed, it couldn't be replaced. And this brings us to the medieval obsession with physical signs of purity. Virginity wasn't just assumed, it had to be proven. Some medical texts describe the hymen as a kind of spiritual seal, something that could and should be inspected. Others claim that virgins look different, clearer skin and lighter step, more serene. Entire marriage rituals revolved around the assumption that a woman's virginity was intact. Blood-stained sheets were sometimes displayed after the wedding night as proof. If there wasn't blood, whispers began. Here's where things get dark. Because of this impossible standard, women who'd been assaulted were often treated the same as those who'd sinned. Virginity lost was virginity lost. The church sometimes allowed for mercy, especially if a confession followed. But socially, the damage was done. Some women entered convents afterward, not always by choice, because their prospects were ruined. The line between victim and seductress blurred under the weight of purity theology. Meanwhile, the church gave men far more space to repent and return. Even priests, yes, priests, despite vows of celibacy. Many clergy members had lovers, even children. The church condemned it, sure, but it also looked the other way when the offending parties had power or wealth. Women involved with clergy were labelled temptresses. Men, weak perhaps, but still redeemable. The virgin-whore dichotomy wasn't just unfair, it was enforced with full institutional hypocrisy. And yet somehow this split found its way into religious art, literature, and culture like ivy through stone. Artists painted women as either saintly or sinful, light or dark, robed or bare. In popular mystery plays, the virtuous maiden was always rewarded, usually with heaven or divine favour, while the lustful woman met a sticky, sulphurous end. Even religious poetry played the game, comparing Mary to a rose unplucked, while describing other women as serpents on snares, or foul temptresses, subtle, not even a little. What makes this even more absurd is how sexual desire itself wasn't treated equally. A man's lust was considered natural but dangerous. A woman's desire, however, was considered unnatural, even suspicious. If a woman expressed desire, verbally, Physically, or even just emotionally, people didn't assume she was human. They assumed she was cursed, corrupted, or in league with something demonic. Because women weren't supposed to want. They were supposed to inspire want, then act oblivious. This created a horrifying paradox. Women were told to be beautiful, fertile, desirable, but not aware of it. They had to be appealing to attract husbands, but not too appealing or they'd be labelled a threat. They were expected to produce heirs, but remain disinterested in the act of producing them. And if they enjoyed sex, even in marriage, that was viewed with suspicion. Good wives endured, saints abstained. No one was allowed to want. There were, of course, exceptions, saints who lived outside the binary, women who found subtle power in piety, or who navigated the system through quiet rebellion. But those stories were rare, and even then, often edited by male scribes into something more palatable. A saintly woman who'd once lived a wild life? She had to repent in tears, starve herself, and renounce everything before being accepted. Holiness was still measured by how effectively she erased her past. And so the pattern hardened. Purity equals virtue. Desire equals shame. Redemption, if offered at all, came through suffering. A whore might become a saint, but only if she wept enough, fasted enough, hurt enough, and never, ever desired again. So here you are, watching every step, every smile, every word. If you're a woman, you walk a line so thin it might as well be invisible. If you're a man, you're told women are both salvation and snare. And everyone's pretending this system makes sense, even as it tears people apart. Because in the medieval church's eyes, you don't get to be fully human. You get to be Mary, or you get to be Eve. Pick your cage. Let's take a moment to talk about the real MVPs of medieval sexual anxiety, the clergy. That's right, the very same men warning you that your thoughts are impure, that your dreams are demon-infested, and that your desires are dragging you toward eternal barbecue. The same guys who built the virgin or whore dichotomy told you to fast from sex half the year, and declared that marriage was spiritual damage control. But here's the kicker. A whole lot of them couldn't follow their own rules. Welcome to the world of clerical hypocrisy, where the shepherds of chastity were often the ones most tangled in the flock. Let's be clear, the medieval church demanded that its priests, monks and bishops remain celibate. Completely. No wives, no lovers, no flirty glances, and absolutely no midnight detours into the candlelit corridors of Roman romance. In theory, they were supposed to be above all that. Celibacy wasn't just policy. It was presented as a kind of moral superpower. The priest was a living symbol of self-denial, someone whose purity let him stand between heaven and earth as an intermediary for everyone else's sins. But here's the thing, celibacy is hard, always has been, especially when it's not just physical abstinence, but the complete rejection of emotional and sexual intimacy for life. And so behind the locked doors of monasteries and rectories, things didn't always stay as pure as they looked from the pews. In towns across Europe, it was an open secret that many priests had housekeepers who weren't just there to dust the altar. Some openly lived with women, some even had children, referred to politely as their nephews. A 13th century bishop in England once had to remind his clergy not to keep concubines in church buildings, because apparently the practice had become so common that people stopped pretending it was scandalous. And it wasn't just the lower ranks. Popes, cardinals and abbots weren't immune. Pope Alexander VI, one of the Borgia popes, had multiple mistresses and acknowledged several children. Imagine that family reunion. Now, in fairness, the church tried to address this. Synods were held, edicts were issued, punishments were threatened. Priests caught with lovers might face fines, reassignment, or in extreme cases, excommunication. But here's the twist. The consequences often depended on who you were. A poor village priest with a mistress might get dragged through the mud. A wealthy bishop with powerful allies? Maybe a scolding, maybe not even that. The rules were strict, but the enforcement was deeply political, and the people knew. Parishioners gossiped, joked, and sometimes shrugged it off. There are letters and songs from the period mocking priests who couldn't keep their cassocks on. One ballad from France describes a village where the priest's niece gave birth right behind the church, and no one was surprised. Some peasants even preferred priests with lovers, believing it made them more human, more relatable. After all, who wants to confess to someone who's never struggled? But this hypocrisy wasn't just a punchline, it had real effects. Imagine being a young woman, told all your life that sexual purity is everything, that your body is a danger, and then you're propositioned by the very man who preaches chastity on Sundays. What do? Refuse and risk public shame, or worse, spiritual blackmail, agree and feel like you've just shattered your soul? In some cases, the imbalance of power turned tragic. There are records of priests coercing women into sexual relationships under the guise of spiritual direction, soul guidance with a side of gaslighting. Confession itself was vulnerable to abuse. The priest knew your secrets. He could frame your silence as stubbornness, your confusion as guilt, and your resistance as proof of sin. And because he was seen as a holy man, his word often carried more weight than yours. And even when the relationships were consensual, if that word even applies in such skewed dynamics, the shame always fell harder on the woman. She might be dismissed from a nunnery, or shunned by her family, or quietly encouraged to vanish into another parish. The priest, if he faced consequences at all, might just get moved. Problem solved. Repeat cycle. This didn't go unnoticed by critics of the church. In fact, many of the earliest reform movements, like the Lollards in England or the Waldensians in southern France, pointed to clerical sexual hypocrisy as Exhibit A in their arguments against the institution. How can they tell us to control our bodies, they asked, when they can't even control theirs? It was a fair question. Too fair, really. Which is probably why the church started cracking down on these critics even harder than on its misbehaving clergy. Still, the hypocrisy wasn't just about behaviour. It was theology too. The same men who preached about the sanctity of celibacy and the dangers of lust were writing passionate letters to their secret lovers, or penning erotic poetry under pseudonyms. One monk in the 12th century, known only by his initials, wrote a series of racy love poems to an unnamed woman, hidden in the margins of a prayer book. Can you imagine? Flipping through the Psalms and finding a verse that starts with, "Your hips are like the curve of the chalice"? Subtle. And here's a particularly weird fringe detail. Some clergy justified their behaviour using twisted logic. If I fall into sin, understand sin better, they reasoned, and thus I can help my flock more effectively. That's right, they pulled the "it's research" defence. Others claimed that a little indulgence was less harmful than pride. Better to sin humbly than to be puffed up with self-righteousness. It was the spiritual version of, "I only do this to stay grounded." Meanwhile, the church's messaging never changed. From the pulpit, lust was condemned. From the confessional, purity was demanded. From the hierarchy, celibacy was enforced. But in the shadows, the rules bent, broke, and were rewritten on the fly. And the people, confused, guilty, afraid, were left trying to navigate a system where the rulemakers couldn't follow their own commandments. This created a spiritual dissonance. You were told to fear desire, but also expected to respect men who clearly felt it. You were told sex was dangerous, but the same danger kept showing up in robes and collars, and the worst part, you couldn't talk about it. To question the clergy was to question God's representatives on earth. To see the cracks was to risk heresy, so you stayed silent, you confessed, you blamed yourself. Because in a world where purity is everything, the burden of sin always rolls downhill. And somehow it always lands hardest on the people who have the least power to begin with. Let's say you're exhausted. You've spent your whole life trying to follow the rules, avoiding temptation, counting holy days, confessing every breath that might be sinful. Your dreams are suspicious, your marriage is anxiety-riddled, and the sermons, still full of flame and worms, but despite everything you stumble. Maybe you touch someone you shouldn't, or think something that makes your stomach flip with shame. You know what's coming next. Penance, fasting, more guilt, maybe even public humiliation. But wait, there's a shortcut. Not cheap, of course, but efficient. Because in medieval Europe, there was a surprising solution to your sins. You could pay for them. Welcome to the church's awkwardly convenient relationship with money. Specifically, how it turned sexual fear into profit. It's the moral equivalent of getting a parking ticket and finding out you can just drop a coin in the box and call it a day. This wasn't backroom corruption, well, not always. It was a system. A formal, structured, spiritually branded enterprise of sin markets and sex taxes. It started small, with penitential tariffs, official handbooks that listed sins and assigned them a corresponding act of penance. Sleep with someone else's wife, fast for 7 years, have sex on a holy day, 3 years, visit a prostitute, pay a fine, say a prayer, maybe take a quick pilgrimage to a local shrine. It was sinner's math, morality turned into a menu. The more serious the offence, the longer or costlier the cure. But as time went on, this turned into a commerce of conscience. If you were wealthy, or knew the right people, you could buy your way out of nearly anything. Priests and bishops began issuing indulgences, certificates that reduced or eliminated the punishment due for sins. Originally, they were only granted for heroic acts, like going on crusade, but eventually indulgences could be purchased for more intimate missteps. Let's say you were caught having sex outside of marriage. Depending on your social status, you could confess, hand over a generous offering, and walk out spiritually squeaky clean. No ashes, no public flogging, just a quiet transaction between your guilt and the church's treasury. It was a win-win. You avoided hell. The church funded a new altar. And don't think this was hidden or secretive. Entire churches displayed lists of prices for indulgences. Want to be forgiven for adultery? 10 coins. Impure thoughts? 5. Masturbation? Well, that depends. How often? The absurdity writes itself. In some towns, friars were accused of hawking forgiveness like street vendors. One chronicler in the 14th century wrote that a man could sleep with a nun, confess it, and be absolved for the price of a dinner. But the real scandal came with licensed brothels. Yes, licensed. In some cities, especially across Italy and parts of France, the church, or the local government under church approval, permitted the operation of brothels and then taxed them. The logic was twisted but oddly pragmatic. If prostitution was going to exist, and it always did, it was better to regulate it than ignore it. So the church collected fees, monitored behaviour, and sometimes even used the revenue to fund hospitals and cathedrals. The moral panic and moral profit lived side by side. This led to bizarre contradictions. You could hear a sermon condemning lust, step outside and pass a brothel paying taxes to the very church that just warned you about eternal damnation. Priests walked the same streets as the fallen women they warned others not to touch. And while some clergy spoke out against the practice, many didn't, because as long as the gold kept flowing, the soul could wait. And speaking of prostitutes, here's where things got even more hypocritical. Women who worked in these brothels were often forbidden from attending Mass or receiving communion. Their presence was considered spiritually contaminating. But the men who visited them, usually not treated the same way. They could confess, say their penance, drop a few coins and go about their business. So while the church taxed these women, it also publicly shamed them, turning them into both a source of income and a moral cautionary tale. There were attempts to clean this up. Some reformers, like the Cistercians or later the Franciscans, pushed for stricter enforcement and denounced the commercialization of sin. But the machine was already rolling. By the late Middle Ages, indulgences had become so widespread and so profitable that the church started using them not just for personal sins, but for fundraising. Want to help build a new cathedral? Buy an indulgence. Want to skip purgatory? Buy one for your dead relatives too. It wasn't just about your sins anymore, it was a family plan, and it wasn't limited to sex. But sexual sins made especially good business. Why? Because everyone struggled with them. Rich or poor, pious or rebellious, lust didn't discriminate. And the church knew it. It created the fear, cultivated the guilt, and then offered you a paid escape hatch. It was like setting fire to your conscience and then charging you for the bucket of water. Modern scholars call this a form of moral economy, a system where morality is mediated through cost. But the irony is hard to miss. The same institution that declared your body impure was making a steady income off its impulses. The priests who preached chastity were funded by the confessions of those who couldn't uphold it. And while the church claimed these systems were about penance and grace, the receipts told a different story. It's not surprising then that people began to grumble. Lay people questioned why forgiveness had a price tag. Some wondered why salvation looked a lot like a tax. This quiet discontent would eventually explode during the Reformation. But that's a bonfire for another night. What matters now is that you lived in a world where your sins weren't just spiritual, they were transactional. Your guilt had a market value. So here you are again, hands shaking, stomach turning, heart filled with shame. You visit the church, confess your thoughts, your touches, your dreams, and the priest, he nods, mutters a prayer and offers you a deal. 3 silver pieces, say a rosary, all will be well, and you walk away lighter, poorer, and a little bit more confused, because grace, you're told, is free. But somehow your sins always come with a price tag. At this point, you've probably confessed more in a single lifetime than most modern people would in 10. Every time you feel desire, bam, sin. Every time you dream something a little too warm, bam, sin, sin. Every time you forget it's a holy day and share a moment of intimacy with your spouse, bam, sin again. And each time you make your way back to the one place you hope will fix you, the confessional. But what started as a spiritual check-in slowly turns into something much bigger, more intrusive, more constant. Welcome to the confession boom, where fear of damnation becomes a weekly ritual, and spilling your secrets isn't just helpful, it's mandatory. Now, confession wasn't always such a big deal. In the early centuries of Christianity, it was more of a public affair. You'd confess your sins to the whole community, yep, just stand up and let it rip, and then serve your penance in front of everyone. Fun, right? But that got messy fast. So eventually the church decided to make it private. One-on-one. You, your sins, and a priest who probably already knew everything because your town only had 20 people in it. Then came the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, and everything changed. That council, kind of like a big theological staff meeting for the church's leadership, made it mandatory for every Christian to confess their sins at least once a year. Once a year. Doesn't sound too intense, right? Except once became twice, then every season, then before communion, before major feast days, before marriage, before death. Suddenly, confession became as routine as Sunday bread and much more terrifying. Because this wasn't just about listing what you did, you had to dig deep. Not just actions, but intentions, not just what happened, but why it happened. Did you feel arousal? Did you invite it? Did you try to stop it? Hard did you try? Were you alone? Or was someone else there? Did you resist? Did you want to resist? Confessors were trained to ask probing questions. And some of those questions, weirdly specific, like uncomfortably specific. There were whole manuals written by theologians and priests dedicated to helping confessors figure out what to ask. Some were dozens of pages long and read like a medieval police interrogation script. For example, a priest might ask, "Have you had intercourse in the wrong position? Did you touch your spouse with excessive fondness? Have you spoken words of temptation or listened to them willingly? Have you emitted seed outside its proper place?" Spoiler, yes, that was a sin too. One manual went as far as to list the exact number of days one should fast for each. Variation of sexual behaviour, whether it was in marriage, outside marriage, solo, accidental, or even just imagined. This wasn't therapy, this was spiritual bookkeeping. Every desire was tallied, every lapse recorded. And of course the language was always gendered. Women were grilled about whether they tempted men, wore clothing too fine, or spoke too confidently. Were they too affectionate with their husbands? Did they enjoy sex? Did they think about someone else while doing it? For men, the questions were similar, but the tone slightly different. A man might be asked whether he lost control, whether he struggled. The underlying assumption was that women were gateways to sin, while men were weaklings trying and failing to hold the line. This level of scrutiny turned confession into a ritual of anxiety. People would agonize over what they might have done wrong. They'd try to remember every stray thought, every flicker of desire, every hint of pleasure they hadn't immediately stamped out. Did I confess that dream I had on Tuesday? Was that moment last week a sin or just a temptation? Better confess it anyway, just in case. And the worst part, if you left something out, deliberately or not, your confession didn't count. It was null, invalid, your soul still black as pitch. You were still marching straight to hell, so you confessed again and again and again. This produced what some modern scholars call scrupulosity, a kind of medieval spiritual OCD. People became obsessed with their moral cleanliness. They confessed daily, hourly. They started to believe they were in constant sin just for existing. One monk wrote that he confessed nearly every time he breathed because his thoughts were never pure enough. Another said he avoided looking anyone into the eye for fear it might cause temptation and require yet another confession. And of course this wasn't just an individual experience, it was communal pressure. Everyone went, everyone confessed. And if you didn't, people noticed. Why wasn't Agnes at the chapel? Why did Thomas leave early? Rumours spread like wildfire. Maybe he's hiding something. Maybe she's fallen into sin. The confessional booth became not just a spiritual station, it became a social checkpoint. Proof that you were still fighting the good fight. Ironically, all this hyper-focus on confession may have increased people's obsession with sex. Think about it. When you spend hours reflecting on your every bodily urge, you're going to notice all of them. The more you're told to suppress something, the louder it screams. The confessional was supposed to free you from sin, but often it just kept you locked in a loop of guilt and shame and self-surveillance. That's the dark genius of it all. The church didn't need spies. It didn't need cameras. It just needed to convince you that your own mind couldn't be trusted, and then offer you a tiny wooden box to spill it all into. They taught you to be afraid of your own instincts and then held the only key to relief, but not permanent relief, just enough to come back again next week or next holy day, or next time your body betrayed you with a flutter of interest in someone's lips. And sure, there were people who genuinely found peace in confession. Some priests were kind, some offered actual guidance, warmth and understanding. But for many, especially when it came to sexual sins, confession became a terrifying performance. A place where your deepest fears were poked and prodded until you bled guilt like a wound that never scabbed over. So here you are, standing outside the confessional once again. Your palms are sweaty, your heartbeat too fast, and your mind a twisted maze of memory and doubt. You step inside, kneel, whisper. The priest listens. He nods. He absolves you. You leave lighter. But only for now, because soon enough, you'll be back. By now, even your thoughts aren't private. You've been taught to confess them, dissect them, flagellate yourself over them. You've stopped trusting your own body, your own intentions, your own capacity to feel anything, without suspecting it might end in damnation. But the fear doesn't stop with you, because as the church's moral net tightens, it starts dragging in things beyond behaviour, beyond flesh. It starts reaching for language, for songs, for poems, for art. Anything that stirs desire becomes suspect, and soon the war on the body becomes a war on the page. Welcome to the medieval crackdown on dirty books and holy censorship. Let's start with the basics. The church, always keen to police not just what you do but what you imagine, knew the power of stories. Words could awaken the soul, but they could just as easily arouse the body. And in a time when many people couldn't read, those who could wielded an outsized influence. So naturally the church set its sights on literature, particularly anything that dared to explore love, lust, or the glorious chaos of human desire. At the heart of this cultural anxiety were the courtly love poets of the 12th and 13th centuries, the troubadours and trouvères of southern France, and later their German and Italian counterparts. Their songs told of noble women, forbidden love, secret longing, and yes, sometimes even sexual fulfillment. These weren't crude tavern ballads. These were refined, poetic, often spiritually confused celebrations of longing, and they were incredibly popular. To the church, that was a problem, because these poems weren't about chastity. They were about yearning, deep emotional, sensory yearning. And while they might not describe sex directly, they walked right up to the edge of it and lingered. A knight pledging himself to a married lady, a noblewoman sending her veil as a token of secret affection, a hidden kiss behind a castle wall. The suggestion alone was dangerous, because suggestion becomes fantasy. Fantasy becomes desire. Desire, so, becomes action. And action, as you know by now, is a ticket straight to hell's hottest furnace. So the church responded the way it often did, with warnings, bans, and sermons filled with barely disguised frustration. Monks were forbidden from reading certain poems. Schools, many of which were run by religious orders, banned love songs from being copied or performed. Some bishops issued blanket condemnations of any secular literature that hinted at romance. Poison for the soul, they called it. But poetry wasn't the only battleground. Illustrated manuscripts, the Netflix of the literate elite, were also targeted. Some noble households owned books filled with romantic tales, biblical soul stories, and yes, little erotic drawings tucked into the margins. The church frowned on these too, not just because of the content, but because of what they represented. Pleasure. Reading for pleasure. Looking for pleasure. Imagining pleasure. In a world where desire was sin, even entertainment became suspect. And then came the church's ultimate flex, the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, or List of Prohibited Books. Though the official list came later in history, starting in 1559, the idea had already taken root by the late Middle Ages. Certain texts were unofficially blacklisted, quietly discouraged, or flat out burned. Not because they were heretical, though that certainly didn't help, but because they were arousing, emotionally, mentally, sometimes even physically. Here's a quirky fringe fact. Ovid's Ars Amatoria, or The Art of Love, a Roman poetic guide to seduction, was particularly hated by medieval church authorities. Despite being ancient, it remained widely read by scholars and courtiers. It was clever, funny, and scandalously practical. Ovid gave advice on how to flirt in the theatre, what compliments to use, how to write effective love letters. Church officials saw it as a how-to manual for sin. Some monasteries even chained copies of Ovid's works in their libraries, not to preserve them, but to keep them from being stolen by horny novices. And the church's own contradictions didn't help, because while it condemned romantic literature, it also used sensual language in religious texts. Mystical writers like Hildegard of Bingen or Bernard of Clairvaux often described the soul's relationship to God in terms of longing, sweetness, even erotic union. Christ was the bridegroom, the soul was the bride, the language swelled with passion. Some of these writings were so emotionally intense they bordered on the erotic, and yet they were holy, sacred, approved. So wait, was desire sinful or divine? That was the blurry line the church danced on. If desire was directed at God, it was transcendent. If it was directed at a human being, even poetically, it was a trap. And so medieval people were left trying to distinguish between the two. When was it okay to feel stirred, to be moved by words, to weep at a love story or smile at a lyric? The answer was never clear, but the risk was, because if you were caught reading the wrong book, or worse, writing one, you could be accused of spreading moral corruption. There were poets who were exiled, scholars who were condemned, and lovers whose stories were stripped of their sensual layers and rewritten to be more pious. Even the Arthurian legends, those tales of Lancelot and Guinevere, Tristan and Isolde, were revised over time. Early versions celebrated their passion. Later ones punished it. Lancelot goes mad, Isolde dies. Love becomes lesson. Romance becomes repentance. And in the cloisters, the crackdown was even stricter. Nuns and monks were only allowed to read certain texts, usually religious, often dry, but that didn't stop smuggling. There are records of manuscripts hidden inside false covers, romantic poems tucked inside Bibles, love notes passed between convent windows. Desire, after all, doesn't respect syllabi, and the more you try to suppress it, the more it finds a way to survive. It wasn't all gloom, of course. Some priests and monks loved poetry, some defended the troubadours, arguing that their songs revealed the bittersweet ache of love which mirrored the soul's longing for God. But they were rare voices in a rising tide of suspicion, and the message to the average believer was clear. If it feels good to read, if it makes you dream or hope or want, be afraid. So now even your imagination is under lock and key. You pick up a book and wonder if it's dangerous. You hear a song and flush with guilt. You try to write a love letter and think twice, because what if someone finds it? What if they say it's sinful? What if it is? And just like that, the war on sex becomes a war on beauty, on art, on thought. The church doesn't just want to control your body, it wants to curate your soul's every word. By now, you've been trained to believe that the body is both battlefield and betrayer. You've been told that desire is dangerous, touch is suspicious, and pleasure is a test you're bound to fail. You've seen the images, heard the sermons, paid the fines, and whispered your shame into confessionals that echo with centuries of guilt. But for some, guilt isn't enough. Feeling sorry doesn't cut it, not when your body still dares to feel, not when your skin still tingles at the wrong thought or dream. So what's left to do? You punish it. You mortify the flesh. No, that's not a metaphor. In the medieval Christian imagination, self-inflicted pain was a legitimate path to holiness. The body was the gateway to sin, so the body had to be disciplined, silenced, even broken. It wasn't enough to resist temptation. You had to show that you hated it, that you were actively at war with it. And what better way to prove your loyalty to God than to bleed for him? Enter the tools of the trade: hair shirts, scourges, chains, stones in shoes, cold floors, hunger, thirst, isolation, and oh yes, whips, real ones, often. Homemade, crafted from knotted cords, twisted leather, or bundled reeds. They were used in secret or in public processions, and always with the same goal: to beat the lust out of you. Monks and nuns embraced this lifestyle with grim determination. Some slept on bare boards with no blankets, even in the dead of winter. Others fasted for days, surviving on bread and water, or less. One famously devoted nun refused even bread unless it had been soaked and chewed first to remove any chance of pleasure from texture. That's right, mouthfeel was too risky. And then there were the flagellants. You might have heard of them, those dramatic processions of half-naked penitents parading through villages during plagues, chanting psalms and whipping their own backs bloody. They weren't just trying to cure disease, they were purging sin. And what sin more than any other did they believe had brought God's wrath upon them? You guessed it, sexual sin. The idea wasn't just that the body caused sin, it was that it remembered it. That every forbidden thought left a mark on your soul, and you had to leave one on your skin to balance it out. So you cut, lashed, or bound yourself. You denied yourself comfort, and the more it hurt, the holier it felt. Pain became prayer. One fringe theologian argued that pleasure and pain were spiritual mirrors. Every pleasure must be undone, he wrote, lest it take root. That wasn't just poetic, it was taken literally. If a monk found himself stirred by a passing servant girl, he might sleep upright in a cold chapel that night. If a nun dreamed of a romance, she might fast for 3 days and pray while kneeling on broken reeds. And if a layperson confessed to impure thoughts, some confessors would assign a week of physical discomfort as penance. Not just prayer pain. This was especially true for women, whose bodies were already viewed as unstable, porous and prone to sin. Female saints were often praised for taking mortification to horrifying extremes. St. Margaret of Cortona reportedly rolled in nettles when she felt temptation. St. Catherine of Siena wore an iron chain so tight around her waist that it left permanent bruises. Others used ropes, spike belts, even bramble crowns to punish themselves for being human. And here's the thing, these women were admired. Their pain wasn't seen as madness, it was seen as spiritual clarity. Proof that they hated sin enough to wound themselves before God had to. In a world obsessed with penance, voluntary suffering was the holy fast track. The church didn't just allow it, they wrote it down, canonized it and passed it on. And yet, not everyone agreed. Some theologians warned that mortification could slide into pride, that hurting yourself might become a twisted form of self-congratulation. Look how holy I am, I haven't eaten in 4 days and my bed is made of thorns. Others noted that too much focus on pain could actually become its own, kind of sensual pleasure, especially when it produced intense emotional highs. Was it possible, they wondered, to become addicted to your own suffering? That debate continues even today. Was mortification about control or self-loathing? Was it sincere devotion or an act of spiritual theatre? Modern psychologists would have a field day analysing the layers of repression, obsession and guilt behind it. But back then, those questions didn't matter. Because in the medieval world, your body was a liability, and any tool that helped you overpower it, no matter how extreme, was fair game. This wasn't limited to the cloistered life. Lay people practiced mortification too. Some wore tight iron rings under their clothes. Others walked barefoot for miles, even in snow, as an offering. Some sat in uncomfortable positions for hours, reciting psalms until their joints ached. Mothers flogged themselves for the sins of their sons. Husbands fasted after sex. And people, young, old, rich, poor, found meaning in the ache. Because pain felt honest. Desire was sneaky. Pleasure untrustworthy. But pain was loud. Clear. Real. It silenced the body. It muffled the inner voice that said, you want, you need, you full, feel. Mortification became a way to clean the slate, reset the soul, and prove, if only to yourself, that you were trying. But even in all this agony, the church never let you forget the score. Mortification might help, but it didn't guarantee anything. You could whip yourself every night and still fall short. Because holiness wasn't just about suffering, it was about submission. Pain alone wasn't enough, you had to mean it. And you could never really know if you meant it enough. So now your day ends not in rest, but in ritual. You light a candle, say your prayers, and then wrap that scratchy shirt around your skin. Or reach for the whip you keep hidden beneath the bed. Just a few streaks, not too hard, but enough to feel it. Enough to remember that you are dust, that you are dangerous, that your desire is still there, waiting. And tomorrow, you'll try again. Because even after all the pain, the hunger, the silence, you still want. After all that fasting and flagellation, you'd think your soul might finally be clean enough to breathe without fear. But no, there's always something else. Because in this system, holiness is never a destination. It's a treadmill. One misstep and you're back at square one, sweating guilt and bargaining for grace. And if you really want to fix what's broken to earn your way back into God's good graces after some carnal catastrophe, better start packing. It's time for a pilgrimage, the original spiritual road trip with blisters, relics, and a side of repentance. Welcome to the world where every mile walked becomes penance, and even your aching feet are holy. Let's be clear, not all pilgrimages were punishment. Some were taken out of devotion, gratitude, or even curiosity. But if you messed up, especially in the sexual arena, a pilgrimage wasn't just recommended, it was assigned, like divine community service. A priest might tell you to walk to Santiago de Compostela for sleeping with someone you shouldn't have, visit the shrine of St. Thomas Becket because you had an affair, make your way to Rome because you had impure thoughts for the third time this week. And these weren't casual strolls. A medieval pilgrimage was a serious months-long, life-disrupting ordeal. You left behind your job, your land, sometimes your family. You carried what you could, begged for the rest, and prayed your shoes held up. The roads were long, muddy, dangerous, and filled with things that could kill you. Robbers, plague, starvation, wolves. And yet people went. Not just nobles and monks, but farmers, widows, even teenagers, walking across countries to kiss a relic and hope their souls were a little less doomed. The destinations were as varied as the sins. Some spots were famous: Rome, Canterbury, Santiago. Others were local, a well blessed by a minor saint, a stone slab with a miracle story, a chapel that supposedly glowed during full moons. Shrines popped up like spiritual pit stops, each one promising some kind of cleansing or indulgence. And the more notorious your sin, the further you might be sent. There are records of people walking from England to Jerusalem because they were caught in long-term adulterous relationships. Talk about putting in the miles for your mistakes. And don't think for a second that this was a solitary affair. Pilgrimages became public acts of penance. People watched you leave, whispered about your sins, maybe even offered alms for your poor corrupted soul. You might be issued a pilgrim's badge, a little metal pin or token to wear on your cloak, marking you as someone on the road for God. But let's be honest, it also marked you as someone who'd done something bad enough to need a personal meeting with a holy thigh bone in a glass box. One fringe tale even tells of a man who, after confessing to sleeping with his cousin, was sentenced to walk to 3 different shrines barefoot carrying a wooden cross. The final destination? A relic of Saint Agnes, the patron saint of purity. He reportedly collapsed right before reaching it. The priest said it was divine justice. Others said he probably just starved. Either way, lesson learned. Of course, not everyone treated it like a punishment. For some, pilgrimages became a vacation from sin, a chance to escape their daily lives, meet strangers, and maybe indulge along the way. There were taverns on pilgrimage roads, minstrels, storytellers, not-so-subtle glances exchanged around campfires. The Canterbury Tales, for instance, gives a perfect snapshot of how diverse these pilgrim groups were. You had the devout, the curious, the flirtatious, the bored. Some walked for God, some walked for gossip, and some, honestly, just wanted a change of scenery. But the church still held the upper hand, because at the end of your journey there was always a ritual. You knelt, you prayed, maybe crawled the final steps, you touched the relic. You might cry or feel clean, or more often just feel exhausted. Sometimes you bought a little trinket to prove you'd made it. Sometimes you left a piece of yourself behind, a lock of hair, a token of the sin you'd carried across mountains and rivers. The message was clear: your body made the journey, so your soul might be safe again. And don't forget the economy behind all this. Entire towns sprang up around pilgrimage sites, their markets thriving on the penitents limping into town. You could buy candles, badges, miracle water, bits of saintly clothing, and, if you knew where to look, a few less than sanctified souvenirs. Monasteries collected donations, relics attracted patrons, and local churches cashed in. Just like indulgences, pilgrimage became another spiritual industry. Holy tourism with your sins stamped on a souvenir spoon. But some critics started to question the sincerity of it all. Was a pilgrimage really about penance if you spent half of it drinking and flirting? Was kissing a relic really a path to salvation, or just another transaction? And what about people who couldn't make the trip, too poor, too old, too sick? Did that mean they were stuck with their guilt forever? These questions didn't go away, and later, during the Reformation, they exploded. Reformers mocked pilgrimage as superstition, attacked relics as fake, and denounced the entire system as spiritual bribery with a walking stick. But in the Middle Ages, before the revolt, it was all very real. And for many, it was all they had. Because in a world where sin clung to you like fog, you needed a way to move through it. And pilgrimage gave you that, literally. You walked the distance between guilt and grace. You felt every step. Every blister, every ache, every stretch of hungry countryside became part of your penance. Your body, for once, wasn't betraying you. It was helping you, even if the church built the road. So here you are, boots worn thin, feet cracked and filthy, eyes fixed on the hill where Aishreen glows through the fog. You reach the top, kneel, whisper your prayer, and hope, just hope, that this time it's enough. So far, everything the church has taught you about sex and the body has been tangled in fear. Fear of desire, fear of pleasure, fear of what happens when control slips for even a moment. But maybe nothing embodies this paranoia, quite like the object that's come to symbolize it all in popular imagination. The chastity belt. A lockable iron contraption supposedly strapped around women's waists to ensure total sexual purity whether they wanted it or not. It's been shown in movies, cartoons and museums. But here's the real twist. Much of what we think we know about chastity belts, probably nonsense. Let's talk about the myth versus the reality. The traditional story goes like that. Medieval men, especially knights leaving for crusade, locked their wives into metal underwear to keep them from cheating. The belts were said to be made of iron, lined with teeth or spikes and secured with heavy locks, making sex physically impossible. In theory, they were a grim guarantee of virginity or marital loyalty. You couldn't sin if the equipment was literally sealed shut. But historians now mostly agree there's no solid evidence that these devices were actually used in the Middle Ages, at least not the way pop culture suggests. The earliest known images of chastity belts come from 14th and 15th century satirical texts, often Italian or French, and they're usually meant as jokes or warnings, not practical advice. Think medieval editorial cartoons. The earliest known physical examples of chastity belts are mostly from the 19th century, and many are likely fakes or misinterpretations. So why did the idea catch on? Because it fits the vibe. Even if the devices themselves weren't real, the attitude behind them absolutely was. The notion that women's sexuality had to be locked away, hidden and controlled was very real. And the idea that men had the right to physically restrict women's bodies for the sake of moral purity, also very real. The chastity belt may be a symbol, but it's a disturbingly accurate one. There were other, more subtle and more believable methods of control. Women in convents, for example, were closely monitored, especially novices. Some monasteries had locked doors, bars on windows, and even grilled confessionals to prevent any sort of visual or physical temptation. A nun might be forbidden to speak alone with a male visitor, even if he was a family member. Some orders had strict grooming rules, forbidding bathing too often, combing their hair too sensually, or even looking in mirrors. Not because they were vain, but because mirrors might stir vanity and temptation. For lay women, the pressure came in other forms. The insistence on virginity before marriage wasn't just social, it was economic. A woman's marriageability hinged on her perceived purity. And while there were no belts involved, there were plenty of invasive tests and humiliating rituals to prove virginity. Some midwives or older women claimed that they could tell, by a girl's gait, voice or complexion, whether she had known a man. Others were called in after wedding nights to examine bloodstains, or the lack of them. And if you were found wanting, your entire future could collapse, dowries could be withdrawn, marriages annulled, families disgraced. So even if no one strapped iron around your hips, your freedom still had chains, made of expectation, suspicion and shame. That said, the idea of locking up desire wasn't limited to women. Men were also told to avoid temptation at all costs. There were stories, probably exaggerated, of men wearing penance devices, like rings with spikes, that pricked if they became aroused, or metal undergarments designed to prevent erections. Some monks reportedly tied themselves down at night to avoid involuntary movements. Others slept with the hands bound to bedposts or tied rough rope around their thighs. Again, evidence is thin, but even the rumours show how deeply the fear ran. And here's a fringe belief for you. Some medieval writers thought that a man's sperm was finite, and that wasting it through masturbation or excessive sex could weaken him spiritually and physically. So controlling male sexuality wasn't just about morality. It was tied to health, strength, and even divine favour. A holy man was one who retained his vital essence. A leaky one, Well, he was weak, pathetic, and possibly headed straight for the inferno. So whether it was metaphorical or mechanical, medieval people obsessed over how to contain sex. The chastity belt became the icon, but the real controls were embedded in daily life. Constant supervision, cultural rituals, religious lectures, and above all a sense that your body was not your own. Which brings us to something even more bizarre, the occasional fetishization of chastity. That's right, sometimes the very thing designed to suppress desire ended up fueling it. Medieval literature is peppered with stories of knights falling in love with virgins, not despite their chastity, but because of it. Purity was eroticized. A woman who didn't know she was beautiful was portrayed as the ultimate object of desire, and the man who earned her, usually through suffering, feats of strength, or spiritual devotion, was seen as morally superior. This paradox ran deep. The same church that warned against lust also glorified the untouched, the unattainable, and the virginal. In paintings, the Virgin Mary was often depicted with downcast eyes, delicate hands, and flowing robes that emphasized her body while insisting on her purity. The message: look, but don't want. And if you do want, feel ashamed. Unless, of course, you're married, then you're allowed, but not too much, and definitely not on feast days. So even if chastity belts were more legend than reality, they represent a truth that's far more unsettling, that people believe controlling sexuality, especially female sexuality, required drastic measures. They didn't need iron to lock up your desire. They already had shame, suspicion, doctrine, and if those failed, there were always the punishments waiting just outside the church walls. And the irony? Even with all that fear, all that restriction, desire still slipped through. In whispered flirtations, in hidden letters, in dreams, in glances exchanged across a feast table or the flicker of a torchlit procession. You can bind the body, you can watch the body, but you can't silence it forever. So now, centuries later, we are left with this strange image, a cold iron belt, displayed behind glass, misunderstood by tourists and fetishized in fiction. And maybe it never saw real use, maybe it was always symbolic, but the fear it represents? That was very real, real enough to scar generations, real enough to still echo. Because sometimes the most powerful cages aren't made of metal at all. So here you are, still wrestling with thoughts you didn't ask for, trapped in a body you didn't design, and shackled to a morality system that seems to punish you simply for being human. You've confessed, you've wept, you've flogged, you've walked halfway across Europe barefoot, but somehow it's never enough. Because it turns out the church doesn't just want you to resist sin, it wants you to marinate in shame, deep, chronic, soul-deep shame carved into your daily routine, like it's just another part of being alive. Welcome to the church's most enduring invention, sanctified shame. It's not about what you did anymore, it's about who you are. Shame, in the medieval church, wasn't just a reaction, it was a virtue, a sign that your conscience was awake, that you feared God enough to blush, tremble, and cringe at the very mention of your own desires. If guilt was about actions, then shame was about identity. And this shift from behaviour to being is where the fear really takes root. Think about how early this started. Children were raised on stories of saints who resisted even thinking about the opposite sex. Little girls were told to guard their modesty like a jewel, while boys were taught to crush any stirring feeling with prayer and cold water. Adolescent curiosity was framed as weakness. Puberty, a divine test. Marriage, a last resort. And the one lesson drilled into everyone's skull over and over was that you are never fully clean. Even married couples were taught to be suspicious of their own pleasure. If they had sex just for fun, without the intention of creating children, it was still a sin. Not the worst sin maybe, but one that required penance all the same. If you felt excitement instead of just duty, if you looked forward to it, if you initiated it, shame, shame, shame. And the tools for reinforcing that shame were everywhere. From sermons to stained glass, from confessionals to daily prayers, the messaging was relentless. Your desires betray you. Your instincts are fallen. You must be on guard against yourself. Take a typical confession. You kneel trembling and list your sins. The priest nods, maybe sighs, maybe furrows his brow when you mention that dream or that feeling you couldn't shake. You get your penance. You're told to reflect, but what really happens? You leave not feeling forgiven, but dirty, unworthy, haunted by the image of yourself as a spiritual failure wearing a skin suit made of sin. And here's where things get especially dark. Because over time, shame doesn't just control you, it becomes you. You start to preempt your own temptation. You stop looking at people too long. You cut your own thoughts short. You don't just hide your feelings, you stop letting yourself have them. A handsome stranger walks by and you don't feel excitement, you feel panic. Because if desire creeps in, you'll have to fight it. And if you can't, you'll have to confess it. And even if you do, God already saw. This is internalized surveillance, a medieval spiritual panopticon. The church doesn't need to be in your bedroom anymore. You've put its voice in your head, and now it talks to you at the worst possible times. It scolds you in the bath, it whispers during dreams, it hisses when your spouse touches your hand and you, God forbid, enjoy it. And shame isn't distributed evenly. As usual, women bore the brunt. They were blamed for arousing men, even accidentally. Too much skin, temptress. Too much eye contact, harlot. Too little social compliance, dangerous. Men were told to resist, but women were told not to cause. So women walked carefully, dressed modestly, spoke softly, and carried the weight of their community's salvation on their shoulders, because if they slipped, men might sin, and if men sinned, well, guess whose fault that was? Even saintly women weren't immune. The more they suffered, the more they were admired. The holiest of them wept for hours over impure thoughts they'd never acted on. They were praised not just for their virtue, but for their visible misery. Because the pain of shame wasn't a bug, it was a feature, a way to prove just how seriously you took your own filthiness. And yes, men were expected to feel it too, just differently. They were supposed to be warriors of the spirit, soldiers in the battle against lust. So their shame took the form of stoicism, distance and long silences. Emotional repression became a kind of piety. If you couldn't beat desire, you could at least act like you'd buried it under layers of denial and self-control. One fringe example, some monks were trained to physically wince when tempted, to treat every intrusive thought like a wasp sting, a quick gasp, a flinch, a look of holy agony. They weren't just policing their behaviour, they were performing their shame. For God, for each other, for themselves. And the church loved this, because the more ashamed you were, the more dependent you became. On confession, on prayer, on ritual, on authority. Shame kept you in line far more effectively than fear of punishment ever could. If you feared hell, you might try to avoid sin. But if you feared yourself, you'd beg the church to save you from the monster within, every week, for life. This kind of shame doesn't go away when you close the chapel doors. It trails you through every aspect of your life, into your marriage, your friendships, your solitude. It changes how you see other people, how you think they see you. You flinch at compliments, distrust affection, feel unworthy of love unless it's earned through suffering. Shame becomes a spiritual second skin, something you wear even when the robes come off. And the saddest part, it feels holy. You're taught that this aching, churning self-disgust is actually a sign that God is working in you. That the more you suffer under it, the closer you are to heaven. That wanting to crawl out of your own body is evidence that you're on the right path. So what do you sinful? You confess more, you fast harder, you cry longer, you isolate, you perform, you pretend, and inside the same voice keeps repeating, you're wrong, you're disgusting, you're a danger to yourself and everyone around you. And that voice, it sounds an awful lot like God, or at least the God the church taught you to fear. At this point, shame has been baked into your bones. You no longer just feel guilt for what you've done, you feel unworthy for what you are. And with each confession, each fast, each act of mortification, you try to scrape that invisible filth off your soul. But what if you reach a point where you no longer believe the church has the right answers? What if instead of burying your instincts, you start to ask, why? Why should desire be sinful? Why should pleasure be feared? Why does salvation have to come soaked in humiliation? Now things get dangerous, because the only thing scarier to the medieval church than sex was someone questioning its control over sex. Welcome to the realm of rebellions of the body. Let's start with the heretics. Not necessarily the kind who worshipped upside-down crosses or danced naked in the woods, though those rumours flew fast. No, many of these rebels were just regular people who decided that maybe, just maybe, the church had overreached. Take the Cathars, a religious group that flourished in southern France during the 12th and 13th centuries. They believed in dualism, the idea that the physical world was corrupt and that spiritual purity meant rejecting the material, including sex. Sounds like they'd be a hit with church authorities, right? Wrong. The church saw the Cathars as a major threat, not just because of their theology, but because they rejected church sacraments, hierarchy, and marriage itself. They taught that sex, even within marriage, was a trap, that the body was a prison, and true holiness required total spiritual liberation. Ironically, their solution to sexual fear was even stricter than the church's, but because they didn't recognize papal authority, they had to go. The church launched a crusade against them, literally. Thousands were killed, towns razed, entire communities erased in the Albigensian Crusade. So much for spiritual discourse. Then there were groups like the Free Spirit movement, which took the opposite approach. These mystics believed the soul could become so united with God that it transcended sin entirely, including sexual sin. They claimed that a truly enlightened person could no longer commit spiritual wrongdoing because they were already one with the divine. Some took this to mean they could abandon traditional morality altogether, eat what they wanted, sleep with who they pleased, and skip confession entirely. The church was not a fan. In fact, some of the most intense inquisitions in the 14th century weren't aimed at witches or pagans, but at these spiritual radicals, people whose very existence said, "I don't need your system," because that was the deepest threat. If someone could find spiritual peace without the rituals, the guilt, the submission, what happened to the church's power? But it wasn't just fringe mystics pushing back. Even ordinary people, peasants, artisans, midwives, started asking hard questions. A woman might wonder why she was expected to stay silent while her husband confessed the same sins over and over. A young man might wonder why monks who preached against lust were caught sneaking into local homes after dark. A widow might ask why her loneliness was seen as sinful if she longed for comfort. And slowly, those questions turned into defiance. Some wrote songs and poems mocking church hypocrisy. Others told folk tales about lusty priests, randy bishops, or clever women who outwitted their confessors. Laughter became rebellion. These stories travelled faster than doctrine, shared over meals, whispered behind barns, scribbled in the margins of prayer books. Some were funny, some were angry, but all of them chipped away at the fantasy that the church had all the answers. And then, of course, came the more organised resistances. You can't talk about rebellion without mentioning the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England. While it wasn't about sex directly, it was fueled by the same fury at a system that demanded obedience, demanded money, and offered shame in return. The rebels burned legal documents, stormed castles, and yes, raided church buildings. They weren't just angry about taxes, they were angry about control, and a system that used fear to keep people compliant, whether about wages or orgasms, was ripe for backlash. Even within the church, cracks began to show. Some priests and monks began to speak more openly about the damage of relentless guilt. A few mystics, like Meister Eckhart, taught that God could be found not through suffering, but through inner stillness. An idea so radical it got him investigated for heresy. Others wrote treatises questioning the obsession with bodily purity. These were small voices, often drowned out, but they mattered. They hinted that not everyone in a robe agreed with the programme. And here's something strange. Midwives, though often feared by the clergy, became accidental rebels too. They understood the body not through theology but through experience. They knew that desire wasn't always dangerous, that birth wasn't always punishment, that women's bodies weren't ticking sin bombs but powerful sacred instruments. The church, of course, distrusted them. Many were accused of witchcraft, especially if they showed too much knowledge, too much independence. But their hands told a different story, a story of life, not shame. The rebellion wasn't always loud, sometimes it was quiet. A couple who chose pleasure anyway, a nun who snuck out to meet her lover, a monk who left the order because he couldn't take the guilt anymore, a peasant who stopped confessing because he no longer believed he was broken. These moments didn't make it into church records, but they happened. Every act of defiance, no matter how small, loosened the grip, and eventually the dam would break. The Reformation was still a century or so away, but the seeds were there. Seeds planted by people who dared to believe that maybe desire wasn't damnation, that maybe the church's fear of sex said more about its control issues than your soul, that maybe shame didn't have to be sacred, so now if you're someone starting to question things, you're not alone. Maybe you still kneel, still confess, still fast. but a voice in the back of your mind has started whispering. Not in temptation, but in curiosity. What if the body isn't the enemy? What if guilt isn't holy? What if all this fear was never divine to begin with? The church would call that voice dangerous, rebellious, heretical, but maybe it's something else entirely. Maybe it's just the first taste of freedom. So now you've walked the road all the way down, through sin and shame, fasting and flagellation, confession and pilgrimage, silences and screams. You've seen how the medieval church didn't just discourage sex, it built an entire architecture of fear around it. A spiritual fortress lined with sermons, laced with doctrine, and staffed by men who were, more often than not, just as confused and fallible as everyone else. But even now, centuries later, the echoes of that fear haven't gone silent. Because the medieval war on sexuality didn't end with the Middle Ages. It morphed, and its legacies of fear are still hiding in plain sight. Take a look around. The language might have changed, but the script remains oddly familiar. Sex is still tangled in morality, still used to measure worth, still policed by institutions that often can't follow their own rules. The same questions that haunted medieval villages in candlelit chapels still show up in modern bedrooms, classrooms and courtrooms. What's pure? What's sinful? What's allowed? Who decides? And who even now still bears the brunt of those decisions? Women. The ancient idea that women's bodies are dangerous, tempting, unlustful, and in need of containment never really died. It just got rebranded. Today's chastity belt might not be made of iron, but it still shows up in dress codes, purity rings, sexual reputation, and the subtle expectation that a woman should be modest, self-controlled, and conveniently uninterested until marriage, and then magically transformed into a confident, devoted lover afterward. Sound familiar? And the guilt? Oh, it's still here. Just scroll through any online advice forum and you'll see it. People agonizing over whether their desires are normal, whether their fantasies are sinful, whether they're broken for wanting what they want. The language of hellfire may have faded, but the internalized shame remains. Only now, instead of confessing to a priest, we confess to algorithms, therapists, and anonymous comment sections. Even institutions still echo the old structures. Some modern churches still preach abstinence as the ideal, still frame sexual purity as a spiritual status, still teach teenagers that desire is a problem to be overcome. Whole curricula are built around fear of the body, of sex, of pleasure. And when those messages fail, as they inevitably do, the blame still lands on the person who dared to feel something. Sound like progress? And let's not forget the industries that have learned to profit off that fear. From virginity pledges to high-priced purity culture events, from books promising to fix your desires to influencers selling moral superiority by the post. It's the same sin economy, just with slicker packaging. Medieval indulgences have been replaced with subscription services, detoxes, and carefully curated guilt trips. You're still being told to fear your own hunger. Only now the solution is a self-help guru instead of a bishop. There's even a modern kind of pilgrimage. Think of the retreats people go on to reclaim their purity. Think of the way some are told to abstain from sex for a certain number of days to become spiritually or energetically clean. Think of the journals, the courses, the 21-day challenges. It's the same spiritual math. Desire plus discipline equals salvation. Only now it comes with a branded tote bag. But to be fair, not everything the church taught about sex was fear-mongering. Tucked into all that anxiety were glimpses, however fleeting, of tenderness, longing, and the possibility of sacred connection. Some mystics wrote about desire not as a curse, but as a mirror of divine love. The problem was never desire itself, it was how thoroughly it got buried under layers of regulation and fear. And that fear, like a ghost, still haunts us. It's in the awkward silences when sex is brought up in classrooms. It's in the hesitation some people feel before saying what they want in a relationship. It's in the lingering belief that pleasure must always be earned, through loyalty, through restraint, through pain. And it's in the quiet voice that whispers, "You're still not clean." But here's where things shift. Because history isn't just a trap, it's a mirror. And looking back at the church's fear-based sexual teachings doesn't have to mean condemning faith or scorning spirituality. It means understanding the machinery, seeing how fear was built, how it was sold, and how it was passed down. Once you see it, you can decide what to carry and what to leave behind. You can start to ask better questions. What does a healthier relationship to desire look like? How do you hold space for pleasure without guilt? What if sex isn't a test or a transaction, but a language of connection? What if holiness and hunger aren't enemies? And maybe most importantly, who gets to decide the answers? Because the legacy of medieval sexual control isn't just about the church, it's about the enduring idea that someone else has the right to own your desire, to tax it, to define it, to forgive it only on their terms. But your body is not a battleground. Your desire is not a defect. And your pleasure is not a sin to be managed. It's a part of being alive. So maybe, just maybe, the next step isn't more guilt, or another confession, or another fast. Maybe it's compassion for yourself, for your messy, complicated humanity. Maybe the real rebellion is to feel what you feel and not be afraid. Because the church used fear to control sexes in the Middle Ages. But you don't have to anymore. So we've come to the end of the road, and congrats, you survived it. Not everyone does. Not when the journey includes demonic seduction, boiling hot sins of the flesh, monks hitting themselves with whips in dark corners, and a 1,000-year guilt trip that's somehow still echoing in your group chats. It's a lot. But now that you've made it all the way through, you can start to breathe again. Not because the story was easy, but because it's finally yours to carry, or let go of on your terms. Tonight we talked about fear engineered with chilling precision of bodies, of pleasure, of the very act of wanting. We talked about how the church didn't just discourage sex in the Middle Ages, it designed entire systems of belief to contain it, monetized guilt, dictated desire, and taught entire generations to distrust their own skin. And we followed that fear through confessions, penances, silences, whispers, iron belts, and a few absolutely bizarre theological acrobatics. But we also talked about the cracks, the doubts, the rebels, the ones who refused to hate their bodies, who told different stories in songs and letters and sideways glances, because no matter how deeply shame was buried, desire never died. It danced at the edges. It bloomed in gardens and campfires, in poems and stolen touches, in the very spaces the church tried hardest to control, because life does that. It leaks in. It grows anyway. So if you're lying there now, staring at the ceiling and wondering what parts of this still live inside you, the answer is probably more than you think. But that's not a curse, it's a chance to name what doesn't serve you anymore, a chance to see how old fears wear new masks, a chance to draw your own lines, ask your own question, feel your own feelings without centuries of guilt clinging to them. You made it through 30 sections of medieval sexual terror. That takes stamina, and maybe a fan on low in the background, because let's be honest, this got a little sweaty. So now just rest. Let the weight of the candles, the incense, the sermons, the chains, all of it melt away. Close your eyes, let your breath slow. You don't need to confess tonight. You don't need to earn anything. You're not a vessel of sin. You're just here, breathing, whole, human, and that truly is holy.